Winter doesn't ask permission to destroy you. It just does. King Vaelor Draven learned that truth the night his empire turned its back on him, not because he was weak, but because he dared to choose a healer over a dynasty. They called him mad. They called him compromised. They stripped away everything except the one thing that terrified him most, the woman who made him human again. This is the story of an alpha who conquered kingdoms but nearly lost himself trying to survive his own heart. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments so I know my tribe is watching. Let's get into this. The Grand War Hall of Moonspire Palace stank of blood and burned ambition. Vaelor Draven stood in the center of it all, battlefield armor still warm from combat, blade dripping onto marble that had cost more than most villages would see in a generation. Around him lay the evidence of conspiracy, bodies of House Raveren's assassins, documents sealed with noble crests, and the shattered remains of what used to be political courtesy. The Imperial Assembly watched in silence. He'd called them here at dawn, dragged them from their beds and their schemes, and now they stood in their hastily donned finery, looking at their king like he'd finally lost his mind. Maybe he had. Maybe sanity was overrated when the alternative was watching the only person who'd ever truly seen him bleed out on palace stairs. Cerys stood beside him, alive, pale but steady. The sight of her breathing was the only thing keeping his hands from trembling. Lord Arcturus Raveren stepped forward from the assembly, his silver beard quivering with barely contained rage. The old war dog had controlled the southern territories for 40 years, and his voice carried the weight of that power. "You've made a grave error, Your Majesty." Vaelor's laugh came out cold and sharp as winter steel. "Have I? Let me tell you about errors, Arcturus. An error is trusting a man whose daughter's marriage proposal came wrapped in assassination contracts. An error is assuming I wouldn't notice when your family's trade ships started moving weapons instead of wine. But the biggest error? The terminal fucking error? Was thinking I'd let you touch her." The assembly shifted. Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dead leaves. Arcturus's face went purple. "You dare accuse House Raveren of—" "I don't accuse," Vaelor cut him off. "I present evidence. Guards!" The palace guards moved forward, holding documents high enough for the assembly to see. Shipping manifests, coded letters, payment records for the assassins who'd nearly succeeded last night. Everything laid bare under the cold morning light streaming through stained glass windows. Arcturus's composure cracked. "This is a fabrication, a desperate attempt to avoid a politically advantageous marriage by slandering, 3 of your men tried to kill my healer last night," Vaelor said quietly. His voice dropped to something soft and infinitely more dangerous. "They came for her first because they knew. They knew that if they wanted to break me, to make me vulnerable enough to control, they needed to take away the one thing I'd started to—" He stopped himself. "Not here. Not in front of vultures who'd use any weakness against him. But the damage was done." The entire assembly had heard him nearly admit it, nearly confess that the untouchable king of Nerith, the man who'd built an empire on the philosophy that attachment was death, had attached himself to someone so deeply that his enemies knew to strike there first. Lady Cerys Vael, still in the blood-stained dress from last night's attack, spoke for the first time. Her voice carried across the hall with unexpected strength. "Lord Raveren, I treated your youngest son last winter when fever nearly took him. I held his hand while he screamed through the worst of it. I taught your wife the remedy that saved him. Is this how your house repays healing? With blades in the dark?" The assembly murmured. Even in a court built on ruthlessness, there were lines. Attacking healers crossed one of them. Arcturus's daughter, Lady Selene Raveren, emerged from the crowd. She was beautiful in that calculated way noble daughters learned early, every gesture practiced, every expression designed, but her eyes were pure ice. "How convenient," she said, "that an attack happens just as our marriage alliance nears completion. How perfectly timed that His Majesty now has excuse to reject a union that would secure southern trade routes and military support. One might think the attack was staged." The hall went silent. Vaelor smiled. It was the expression that made enemy commanders surrender without fighting. "Stage an attack? In my own palace? Kill 8 guards and wound a dozen courtiers just to avoid marrying your ambitious ass? Selene, I've conquered kingdoms with less effort than that would require. If I wanted to refuse your house, I'd have just refused. I'm the fucking king. Then why haven't you? Celine shot back. Why drag this out with theater and accusations? Unless the simple truth is too humiliating to admit, that you've allowed a palace healer to compromise your judgment so completely that you'd sacrifice strategic advantage for whatever comfort she provides in the dark. Cerys flinched. Vaelor felt the movement even though she stood 2 feet away. Something in his chest went cold and tight. Careful, he said softly. I speak truth, Your Majesty. The renewal rite was a season. Winter's ended. Spring demands you remember what you are, a ruler, not a man ruled by sentiment. Send her back to her gardens before she costs you more than an alliance, before she costs you the respect that keeps this empire from tearing itself apart. The assembly was watching, waiting. Every eye in that hall measured him against his own philosophy, his own words about how attachment destroyed judgment. This was the moment they'd all anticipated, the moment their Iron King would prove he was still iron. Vaelor looked at Cerys, really looked at her. She stood there in her healer's dress with blood on the hem, some of it hers, most of it from wounded courtiers she'd treated even while her own shoulder bled from a knife wound. Her hair had fallen from its pins hours ago. She had dark circles under eyes that hadn't seen sleep since the attack. She looked exhausted and terrified and absolutely determined not to show either. She looked like the only real thing in a room full of performance. He'd spent 20 years building an empire on the principle that this moment, this exact scenario where emotion threatened strategy, was the ultimate test of kingship. That a true ruler sacrificed personal desire for political necessity without hesitation. His father had failed that test. Crumbled it. Nearly destroyed Nerith trying to protect a beloved queen from the brutal mathematics of sovereignty. Vaelor had sworn never to repeat that weakness. But as he stood there in his blood-stained armor with evidence of conspiracy around him and vultures circling, he realized something that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. His father hadn't been weak. His father had been the only man in that whole damned palace who'd understood what actually mattered. Vaelor turned back to the assembly. House Raveren's proposal is rejected, permanently. Any further alliance discussions are terminated. Lord Arcturus, you and your family have 1 week to leave Imperial territory. Your lands remain yours, your titles remain intact, but your access to court ends today. Consider it mercy. I'd have been justified taking your head. The hall erupted. Nobles shouted, some in outrage, some in approval. The assembly fractured into chaos that had been building since the moment he'd chosen Cerys at the renewal rite. Through it all, Arcturus stood frozen. You're choosing her, he said. His voice cut through the noise with disbelief. A healer. Over military alliance, trade security, and political stability. Your father made that mistake. My father, Vaelor interrupted, his voice dropping to something that made the entire assembly go quiet, loved my mother so completely that when illness took her, he nearly followed her into the grave. Grief broke him. It made him vulnerable, made him weak in ways that let vultures like you start circling the throne. I watched it happen. I was 14 years old, and I watched my father weep over her body while his kingdom began to crumble around him. You know what I learned from that? The hall waited. I learned that love is the most dangerous force in this world. That attachment gives your enemies a blade to cut you with. That a king who lets his heart rule him endangers everyone who depends on his strength. And I spent 20 years building this empire on that lesson. 20 years governing like a man who'd cut out his own heart to protect his kingdom. He paused. But last night, when steel came for her in the dark, I killed men without hesitation, without strategy, without calculating whether saving her was worth the political cost. And you want to know the terrifying truth? I'd do it again. I'd do it 1,000 times. I'd burn this entire empire to ash before I let her die. Cerys made a small sound. He couldn't tell if it was protest or something else. So yes, Arcturus, I'm choosing her. Not because she's compromised my judgment, but because she's the only person in this God's damn palace who reminds me I have judgment worth keeping. Every other voice in my life wants me to be a weapon, something sharp and useful and completely inhuman. She's the only one who looks at me and sees a man who might be capable of something other than conquest. Lady Celine Raveren stepped forward again. Pretty words, Your Majesty. But words don't feed starving provinces or defend borders or maintain the fear that keeps your enemies at bay. What happens when the empire realizes their king cares more about his healer than their survival? When rebellion spreads because you've shown weakness? Then I'll crush the rebellion, Vaelor said flatly. Same as I've crushed every other threat to this kingdom. My capability as a military commander hasn't been compromised by caring about someone. If anything, it's sharpened. You want to know why? Because now I have something worth fighting for beyond abstract concepts of legacy and empire. Now, when I defend these borders, I'm protecting something real. He looked around the hall at faces he'd governed for years. Some loyal, some calculating, all measuring him against impossible standards of inhuman perfection. You built me into this, all of you. You wanted a king who felt nothing, risked nothing, sacrificed everything for the empire's survival. You got that king. He won you wars, expanded your territories, filled your treasuries, but that king was eating himself alive from the inside out, governing from a place of pure survival instinct instead of actual vision. You want that back? You want the version of me that sees people as chess pieces and provinces as numbers on a map? No one spoke, because I don't. I'm tired of it. 20 years of perfect control, and I can't remember the last time I felt like anything other than a weapon someone pointed at problems. She's the first person since my mother died who's looked at me and seen something worth saving underneath the crown. The vulnerability in his voice made several nobles shift uncomfortably. They weren't used to this. None of them were. The Iron King didn't confess uncertainty. Saris moved then, just a half step closer. Her voice was quiet but clear. He's right about one thing. I do see a man underneath the crown, but I also see the weight he carries. Every decision that keeps people alive or gets them killed. Every strategy that means stability or starvation. You all stand here judging him for caring about someone, for letting emotion influence his rule. But you're the same people who beg for mercy when your sons need healing or your daughters need protection. You want him to be inhuman until you need him to be human. You can't have both. Silence fell over the hall. She continued, her words gaining strength. I didn't ask to be part of this. I didn't manipulate or seduce or scheme my way into his life. I got shoved into him during a festival and suddenly became everyone's favorite symbol of his supposed weakness. You want to blame someone for compromising your king? Blame yourselves for creating an environment where basic human connection is treated as catastrophic failure instead of necessary balance. A younger noble, Lord Caston from the Eastern Territories, spoke up. But Lady Vale, surely you understand the concern. His Majesty's father lost my mother and nearly destroyed the kingdom, grieving her. Yes, I know the story. Everyone here knows it. It's become the foundational myth of this empire. Proof that love makes rulers vulnerable. But has anyone stopped to consider that the vulnerability wasn't the love itself? That maybe the problem was your father had no infrastructure of support, no culture of balance, no permission to grieve like a human being while still governing effectively? She looked directly at Vaelor. He built this empire by cutting away everything soft in himself. And yes, it worked. But sustainability isn't just about conquest and control. It's about creating systems that don't require the ruler to be a perfect machine. You're afraid he'll make his father's mistake, but the real mistake is forcing him into a corner where he has to choose between being effective and being human. Those shouldn't be mutually exclusive. The assembly processed this. Lord Arcturus made one final attempt. So the king admits he's compromised, admits his judgment is influenced by personal attachment. And we're supposed to trust that influence won't cost lives when hard decisions come? When he has to choose between her safety and imperial security? If it comes to that, I'll make the choice that protects the most people, Vaelor said. His voice was steady as stone. I'm not saying personal connection makes me infallible. I'm saying it makes me fight harder to be worthy of that connection. You think I'll choose wrong? Watch me. Test me. But stop pretending the last 20 years of perfect isolation produced better leadership. It produced conquest, yes. It produced fear and expansion and absolute control. But it also produced a kingdom where people obey out of terror instead of investment, where loyalty is performance instead of genuine commitment. He paused, letting his next words land with full weight. I want better than that. And if trying to be better means some of you lose confidence in my rule, then let's settle it now. Any house that can't stomach serving under a king who admits to caring about someone can leave. Take your lands, your titles, your ambitions elsewhere. I'll govern the houses that remain, and we'll see which version of empire actually survives." No one moved, because they all knew the truth. Vaelor Draven was the only thing holding Nereth together. His military genius, his brutal efficiency, his absolute command of strategy. Those weren't diminished by personal attachment. If anything, the fear in that room had just intensified. A king who'd been dangerous when he had nothing to lose was absolutely terrifying now that he had something worth protecting. The assembly began to fracture. Some nobles started the slow calculation of political realignment. Others moved to consolidate positions in this new paradigm. The machinery of empire grinding into motion around a shifted center of power. Arcturus Ravarin stood alone in the middle of it all, looking at the king he'd tried to control. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. "Maybe," Vaelor replied, "but not as much as I'd regret the alternative." Guards escorted House Ravarin from the hall. The assembly slowly dispersed, nobles departing in clusters of urgent conversation. Within an hour, the Grand War Hall stood nearly empty except for Vaelor, Cerys, and a handful of advisors too stunned to leave. General Thorn, Vaelor's oldest military commander, approached carefully. "That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen in 40 years of service," he said. "Can't decide which." "Both, probably," Vaelor admitted. "The southern trade routes? I'll secure them another way. There's always another way, and the political instability this creates already existed. We just stopped pretending otherwise." Thorn studied his king for a long moment, then looked at Cerys. "You'd better be worth it," he said bluntly, "because he just bet the empire on you." Cerys met his gaze without flinching. "I didn't ask him to." "No," Thorn agreed, "but you'll live with the consequences anyway. That's how this works." He saluted and left. Alone finally, Vaelor felt the adrenaline of confrontation begin to drain. His hands started shaking, aftermath of violence and political suicide combined. The armor suddenly felt impossibly heavy. Cerys moved closer. "Are you all right?" He laughed. It came out brittle. "I just destroyed a major political alliance, publicly admitted to attachment that everyone will use against me, and possibly triggered internal instability that could take years to stabilize. So, no. Not particularly all right. Why did you do it?" "Because the alternative was worse." She touched his arm lightly. Even through armor, the contact steadied something in him. "What happens now?" she asked. "Honestly, I have no idea. This isn't terrain I've navigated before. I've conquered territories, crushed rebellions, negotiated treaties. All of it made sense. But this? Choosing personal connection over political advantage? I don't have maps for this, Cerys. I'm completely outside my strategic comfort zone. Does that terrify you?" "Absolutely." "Good," she said. "Fear means you're taking it seriously." He looked at her properly then. This woman who'd been accidentally shoved into his life and somehow become the center of it. Who'd stood beside him in front of the Empire and defended him with words sharper than any blade. "They'll come for you," he said quietly. "Not with assassins. They know that won't work now. But politically, socially. They'll try to isolate you, make you toxic to associate with. They'll paint you as manipulative, dangerous, the weakness that destroys kings. Can you handle that?" "Can you?" she countered. "I've handled worse. Then I'll manage." She smiled slightly. "Besides, I'm not alone. I have you." The simple certainty in her voice did something to the knot of fear in his chest. Didn't eliminate it, nothing could do that, but made it bearable. "We should get you to the healers," he said. "That shoulder needs proper treatment. I am a healer, which means you're terrible at treating yourself. Come on." They walked through Moonspire's marble corridors in the strange morning light. Nobles who'd been at the assembly watched them pass with expressions ranging from horror to calculation. The palace felt different, charged with new energy, new danger. In the healer's wing, Cerys finally let exhaustion show. She sat on a treatment bed while another healer worked on her shoulder wound. Vaelor stood guard, unwilling to let her out of his sight even in the most secure part of the palace. A young healer, barely 20, kept glancing at him nervously. "Something to say?" Vaelor asked. The healer jumped. Your Majesty, I served in the Eastern campaigns, field medicine, And I wanted you to know that what you said in there about being more than a weapon, it mattered. To hear you say it." Vaelor studied the young man. "What's your name?" "Micah, Your Majesty." "You save lives, Micah. You patch soldiers back together so they can return to battle or return to their families. You see them at their most vulnerable. Tell me honestly, which version of king do you think serves people better? The one who sees you all as useful tools, or the one who remembers you're human beings worth protecting?" Micah didn't hesitate. "The second one, Your Majesty," without question. "Then spread that message. Because I guarantee half the palace thinks I've lost my mind, and the other half thinks I've been compromised. Let them know from someone who's worked in field conditions what actually motivates soldiers to fight. It's not abstract loyalty to empire, it's protecting what they care about." "Yes, Your Majesty." After Micah finished with Cerys's shoulder, Vaelor walked her to his private chambers. Not to the guest quarters where she'd been staying, but to his own rooms, a deliberate statement that would send messages throughout the palace. The rooms were austere compared to most royal suites. Practical furniture, military maps on the walls, a desk covered in reports. But there was also the private library she'd discovered, the door to the greenhouse where rare moon orchids grew, the spaces where he'd been quietly human when no one was watching. "You meant what you said," Cerys observed, "about burning the empire." "Yes. That's insane. Probably. But it's also true. Last night when they came for you, I stopped being strategic, stopped calculating cost-benefit analysis, just reacted, killed anyone between me and you without hesitation. Afterward, standing in that blood, I realized I'd crossed a line I can't uncross." She sat on the edge of his bed, another deliberate gesture. "Your father loved your mother that much." "He did. And it broke him when she died. The empire nearly fell apart while he grieved. I watched it happen, watched strong commanders become weak without his leadership, watched provinces start to rebel because they sensed vulnerability. That's why everyone's terrified of me repeating his mistake." "But you're not him," Cerys said. "How do you know?" "Because he didn't have what you have. An empire he built himself through sheer capability. Your legitimacy isn't inherited, it's earned through every victory, every expansion, every time you've proven yourself the most dangerous force in the Northern Territories. People don't follow you out of tradition. They follow you because you're effectively unchallengeable. Unless attachment makes me vulnerable. You think vulnerability is weakness?" She shook her head. "Vulnerability is what forces you to build stronger structures around yourself. Your father crumbled because he was alone in his grief, isolated by the same culture of imperial perfection that you've perpetuated. You're choosing different. You're saying that care and capability can coexist. And if I'm wrong, then we'll be wrong together." The simplicity of it struck him. After years of shouldering every decision alone, calculating every risk in isolation, the idea of shared consequence felt foreign and strangely precious. He sat beside her. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. "Be a king and a man simultaneously." For 20 years they've been separate, king in public, human only in these private rooms where no one could see. Now you're asking me to integrate them. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm just refusing to pretend you're only one or the other. You're both. You've always been both. The Empire's been the one demanding you hide half of yourself. Outside the windows, spring morning light touched Moonspire's towers. The city below began to wake. Merchants opening shops, guards changing shift. The ordinary machinery of empire grinding forward, regardless of upheaval in the palace above. "What do you need?" Cerys asked. The question surprised him. "What?" "Right now. What do you need to feel steady enough to handle what comes next? Because something's coming. House Ravorin won't leave quietly, and every ambitious noble in the empire just learned you have a pressure point they can exploit. So before that storm hits, what do you need?" No one had asked him that in years. Maybe ever. He thought about it. "Tell me I didn't just destroy everything. You didn't. How do you know?" "Because destruction would require you losing your core capability. You haven't. You're still the same military genius who expanded this empire, the same strategist who sees patterns others miss, the same commander who wins battles before they're fought. Caring about someone doesn't erase that. It just gives you additional reason to deploy it." He wanted to believe her. "What do you need?" he asked in return. She looked at him with complete honesty. "I need you to stop treating this like a battlefield where you're doomed to lose. You've spent 20 years preparing for every external threat. You know how to handle military campaigns, political conspiracies, economic challenges. But you're completely unprepared for something good happening to you, for someone seeing your worst parts and choosing to stay anyway. That terrifies you more than any enemy commander ever has. He couldn't deny it. So what do I do? Stop waiting for me to become a weakness you have to defend against. Start trusting that I can be a strength you fight beside. The phrasing struck him. Beside, not behind. They'll use you against me. Let them try. I'm tougher than I look. I know, that's what scares me. If you were fragile, I could lock you away in safety. But you won't accept that. You'll insist on standing beside me, being visible, making yourself a target. Yes, she agreed. That's exactly what I'll do. And you're going to have to get comfortable with it. Before he could respond, urgent knocking hammered the chamber doors. Vaelor opened them to find General Thorn looking grim. We have a situation, he said. The southern provinces received word of what happened in the assembly. 3 border lords have declared they won't recognize your authority if you proceed with rejecting House Raverin. They're calling for an imperial council to discuss succession. Vaelor felt something cold settle in his chest. Succession. They're questioning my right to rule. They're testing whether this morning broke something fundamental, whether you've compromised yourself enough that they can move against you. How many troops do they command? Combined? Roughly 20,000. Not enough to seriously threaten Moonspire, but enough to cause significant destabilization if they coordinate rebellion. Cerys appeared beside him. This is happening because of me, she said quietly. This is happening because I gave them excuse, Vaelor corrected. They've been waiting for opportunity. I just handed them one. Can you put it down? Thorn asked. Military response? I can, but it'll cost lives and create martyrs. Better to isolate the leaders, demonstrate overwhelming force, and force surrender before full conflict erupts. And if they don't surrender, then I remind the Empire why I'm king. The cold certainty in his voice made even Thorn look uncomfortable. Vaelor turned to Cerys. You should stay here, behind walls and guards. She looked at him like he'd suggested something absurd. No, Cerys, I'm going with you. It's not safe. Neither is staying here alone while you're gone. At least with you, I know someone's watching my back. He wanted to argue, wanted to lock her in the most secure room in Moonspire and build walls between her and anything dangerous. Every instinct screamed to protect by isolating. But he'd just given an entire speech about integrating his humanity with his kingship, about letting care and capability coexist, which meant trusting her to stand beside him even when every cell in his body roared to shield her from consequences. All right, he said finally, you come, but you follow orders in combat situations without question. Fair. Thorn looked between them with an expression that suggested he thought they'd both lost their minds. We leave within the hour, he said. I'll prepare the cavalry units. After Thorn left, Vaelor pulled Cerys close. If something happens to you because I let you come, then we handle it together, she interrupted. That's what you chose this morning. Stop second-guessing. But the fear was real and visceral, the kind of terror that had ruled his entire philosophy of kingship for 20 years. He was about to ride into potential combat with the one person whose safety mattered more than strategic advantage. Everything his father had taught him about the dangers of attachment was about to be tested against the brutal mathematics of actual warfare. And for the first time in his reign, King Vaelor Draven had absolutely no idea if he'd made the right choice. The southern borderlands looked like something out of nightmares men had after too many battles. Vaelor rode at the head of his cavalry column with Cerys positioned 3 horses behind him, surrounded by his most trusted guards. The landscape stretched flat and hostile. Dead grass, skeletal trees, and a sky the color of old bruises. 3 days of hard riding had brought them to the edge of Lord Corvin's territory, where the rebellion had taken root like infection in a wound. General Thorn rode beside him, face carved from stone and strategy. Scouts report Corvin's forces are dug in at the old fortress ruins, 5 miles ahead, roughly 8,000 troops visible. The other 2 lords haven't committed their forces yet. They're waiting to see how this plays. Smart, Vaelor said. Let Corvin test my resolve, then decide whether to pile on or back down based on results. We could bypass Corvin entirely. Force the other lords to commit or surrender without bloodshed. No. Corvin declared rebellion first, He gets answered first. The others need to see what happens when you question my authority. And if he's counting on that response, if this is a trap, then we spring it and kill everyone inside. The simplicity of it made Thorn almost smile. Almost. Your healer's holding up better than I expected, he observed. Vaelor glanced back. Sarah sat straight in her saddle despite 3 days of riding that would have broken softer nobles. Her face showed strain but not surrender. She caught his look and held it. No reassurance needed, no weakness displayed. She's tougher than most of my commanders, Vaelor admitted. That's what worries me. Tough people think they're invincible right up until the moment they're not. I'm aware of the risk. Are you? Because respectfully, Your Majesty, you've never gone into combat with a vulnerability this visible before. Every enemy on that field will know who to target to break you. Let them try. Thorn's expression said he'd heard famous last words before. They reached the fortress ruins by midday. The structure was old empire architecture, crumbling walls, collapsed towers, defensive positions that had defended nothing for a century. Lord Corvin had positioned his forces well, using the ruins for cover while maintaining clear sightlines for archers. A rider approached under white flag, young, arrogant, wearing Corvin's house colors. Lord Corvin requests parley, the rider announced. He'll meet King Vaelor in the center ground between forces, each accompanied by 5 guards. Vaelor studied the distance. Acceptable. 1 hour. The rider departed. It's a trap, Thorn said immediately. Obviously. But I want to hear what Corvin thinks he's accomplishing before I crush him. And Lady Vael? Stays with the main force behind defensive positions. Vaelor rode back to where Saris waited with her guard detail. Parley in an hour, he told her. You stay here with Captain Renford and 24 cavalry. Anyone approaches who isn't wearing my colors, you ride hard for Moonspire and don't look back. I'm not running. You are if I give the order. This isn't negotiable, Saris. Parley means close quarters, limited guards, and maximum opportunity for assassination. I need to know you're secured before I walk into that situation. She looked at him with frustration that barely masked fear. You're using me as leverage against yourself. Forcing yourself to stay controlled because you know I'm watching. Yes, exactly that. Is it working? Too well, she said quietly. I hate it. Good. Fear keeps people alive. He wanted to touch her, pull her close and feel her breathing just to confirm she was real and safe. But they were surrounded by hundreds of troops who were watching their king for any sign of weakness. The men needed to see absolute confidence. So Vaelor just held her gaze for 3 seconds longer than strategy required, let her see the fear he couldn't speak aloud, then turned and rode toward the parley ground. The space between armies felt like walking into a mouthful of teeth. Lord Corvin waited with his 5 guards, all seasoned fighters, all positioned to maximize threat. Corvin himself was 60, gray-bearded, and radiating the kind of confidence that came from 40 years controlling southern trade routes. Your Majesty, he greeted, thank you for meeting. Let's skip the courtesy, Vaelor said. You declared rebellion. I'm here to answer it. What's your opening position before I destroy you? Corvin smiled. Direct. I appreciate that. My opening position is simple. Withdraw your attachment to the healer, accept marriage alliance with House Ravarin, and reaffirm the traditional philosophy of imperial rule. Do that, and we'll bend knee and pretend this unfortunate disagreement never happened. And if I refuse? Then we test whether your attachment has compromised your capability as military commander. Whether you can still function effectively when someone you care about is in immediate danger. The threat landed like a blade between ribs. You're saying you'll target her. I'm saying that's already happening. My forces include specialists who've been watching her position since you arrived. She's surrounded by guards, yes, but guards can be distracted, overwhelmed, and healers are soft targets when steel comes calling. Vaelor felt something cold and ancient wake up inside him, the part that had built an empire through calculated brutality, the part that understood violence as language. You just made a terminal mistake, he said quietly. Did I? Corvin leaned forward in his saddle. Let me explain the mathematics, Your Majesty. You have superior forces and better commanders. In straight combat, I lose. But I'm not offering straight combat. I'm offering you an impossible choice. You can pursue military victory and risk her death, or you can protect her and let rebellion spread. Either way, You prove that attachment has compromised your effectiveness as ruler. It's an elegant trap, Vaelor admitted. You've backed me into a position where any choice validates your accusation. Very clever. Thank you. One problem, though. Corvin waited. You're assuming I'll choose. That I'll let your framework define my options. But I didn't build an empire by accepting limitations other people imposed. So here's what's actually going to happen. I'm going to kill you and everyone you brought here. Then I'm going to ride to your estate and explain to your family exactly why you don't exist anymore. And when the other two lords hear what happened, they'll realize that threatening her doesn't give them leverage. It gives them a death sentence. Corvin's confidence cracked slightly. You're bluffing. Test it. The older lord studied Vaelor's face and apparently didn't like what he found there. You've changed, he said. The Iron King I knew wouldn't make threats. He'd calculate, strategize, find the optimal solution. But you're not calculating anymore. You're reacting. That's exactly the compromise we're trying to prevent. No, Vaelor corrected. The Iron King you knew would have found a political solution that minimized bloodshed and maintained stability. He would have sacrificed personal desire for strategic advantage without hesitation. That king died 3 nights ago when assassins came for her. What you're dealing with now is something much more dangerous, a ruler who's decided that some things matter more than optimal outcomes. That's weakness. That's evolution. I'm done pretending attachment is incompatible with capability. You want to test whether I can protect her and destroy you simultaneously? Let's find out. He turned his horse. Wait, Corvin called out. You're not even going to consider negotiation? I just negotiated. You threatened someone under my protection. I offered you death. That's the full scope of our diplomatic options. Vaelor rode back toward his lines. Behind him, he heard Corvin shout orders, heard the fortress ruins explode into activity as 8,000 troops prepared for combat. Thorn met him at the defensive position. Well? He threatened her directly, said he has specialists targeting her position. Then we need to move her immediately. No. We use her exactly where she is. Corvin thinks she's my weakness. Let him commit a specialist to that assumption. When they reveal themselves going for her, we'll know where his best troops are concentrated. You're using her as bait, Thorn said flatly. I'm using his assumptions against him. There's a difference. Not much of one. Vaelor looked at his general. You think I'm compromised? I think you're making decisions you wouldn't have made a week ago. Whether that's compromise or growth, I honestly can't tell yet. Fair enough. What's your strategic assessment? Thorn pulled out a rough map. Corvin's dug in well. Direct assault would be costly. He's got archers positioned on the high ruins, cavalry ready to flank from the tree line, and probably some trap in the center approach. He's also clearly coordinating with someone. Those weapons his troops are carrying are fresh Imperial forge work. Someone's funding this rebellion. So we're not just putting down Corvin, we're sending a message to whoever's backing him. Exactly. Which means we need prisoners for interrogation. Can't kill everyone. We can kill most of them, Vaelor said. Leave a few alive to answer questions. The battle unfolded like most battles did. Chaos wrapped in structure, brutality disguised as strategy. Vaelor led the center assault while Thorn commanded flanking cavalry. The fortress ruins became a meat grinder of steel and screaming. Corvin's archers took heavy toll in the initial advance, but Vaelor's forces had better armor and more experienced commanders. 3 hours in, the tide turned. Corvin's defensive positions collapsed under sustained assault. His flanking cavalry got caught in a countermaneuver that cost him 200 riders. The specialists he'd positioned to target Cerys revealed themselves too early and got swarmed by her guard detail before they could close distance. By sunset, Lord Corvin was retreating toward the tree line with whatever forces remained mobile, and that's when everything went wrong. Vaelor was pursuing the retreating forces when a runner from the main camp found him. Your Majesty, Lady Vael's position is under attack. His blood went cold. What? Different force. He came from the opposite direction. 50 riders minimum, moving fast. That was impossible. All of Corvin's forces were accounted for. Unless Corvin had never been the main threat. Unless the entire battle had been distraction. Vaelor wheeled his horse and rode hard for the camp. The scene that met him made his vision go red. Bodies of his guards lay scattered around defensive positions that had been overrun through sheer numbers. Captain Renford was down, but breathing. And in the center of it all, Ceres stood surrounded by 6 attackers wearing no house colors at all. Professional soldiers. Mercenaries. One of them had a knife to her throat. Vaelor pulled his horse to a stop 20 feet away. The mercenary holding Ceres smiled. King Vaelor, so good of you to join us. Who sent you? Does it matter? We're here. She's here. And you're about to make a choice that defines your entire reign. Every cell in Vaelor's body screamed to attack, to close distance and kill anything threatening her. But tactical assessment cut through rage. 6 professionals, close quarters, blade already at her throat. She'd be dead before he reached them. What do you want? He asked. Same thing Corvin wanted. Proof that you're compromised, that attachment has destroyed your judgment. Right now, you're supposed to be securing victory, capturing Corvin, consolidating your military advantage. Instead, you abandoned pursuit the moment she was threatened. You just proved their point. Vaelor dismounted slowly. Let her go, and I'll let you live. The mercenary laughed. That's not how this works. You let Corvin escape, or she dies. Simple choice. There it was. The impossible decision Corvin had promised. Victory or her safety. Empire or attachment. Everything his father had been destroyed by, crystallized into one moment. Vaelor looked at Ceres. Her eyes were terrified but clear. She gave the smallest shake of her head. Don't do it. Don't sacrifice the Empire for me. He looked back at the mercenary. You think you understand the choice you're offering, he said. You think it's between her life and imperial stability, between personal attachment and strategic necessity. But you fundamentally misunderstood what kind of ruler I am now. The mercenary's grip tightened on the knife. Vaelor continued, his voice dropping to something soft and absolutely lethal. A week ago, you'd be right. A week ago, I would have calculated the cost-benefit, recognized that one life, even hers, wasn't worth letting rebellion succeed. I would have sacrificed her to maintain imperial authority. That was my philosophy. Attachment was weakness. Emotion was compromise. Rulers who let personal feeling influence strategic decisions endangered everyone. He took a step forward, but that philosophy was built on terror, on the fear that if I cared about anyone, I'd become my father, broken by grief, destroyed by love. So I spent 20 years governing like a machine, perfect control, zero vulnerability, absolute dominance. And it worked. I built the most feared empire in the Northern Territories. Another step. What I didn't realize was that perfection was its own prison, that control driven by fear is just another form of being controlled. I wasn't strong. I was trapped inside a survival mechanism I'd mistaken for philosophy. The mercenary shifted nervously. His voice hadn't risen, but something in his tone made violence feel imminent. She changed that, Vaelor continued, not by making me weak, by making me realize that strength without purpose is just well-organized cowardice. I'm not governing out of fear anymore. I'm governing because I chose to, and that choice includes her. He stopped 10 feet away. So here's what you're actually offering me. A chance to prove that caring about someone and being an effective ruler aren't mutually exclusive. That I can protect her and secure the empire. That attachment doesn't compromise capability. It focuses it. The mercenary pressed the blade harder against Ceres' throat. A thin line of blood appeared. Last warning, Your Majesty. Call off pursuit of Lord Corvin or she dies. Vaelor smiled. It was the expression that made enemy commanders surrender. You're not going to kill her, he said calmly. The mercenary blinked. Watch me. No. Because the moment you do, there's no reason for me to keep you alive. Right now, you're bargaining chips. The second she's dead, you're just obstacles between me and the people who hired you. And trust me, you do not want to be obstacles. He looked at each mercenary in turn. But if you release her unharmed and tell me who sent you, I'll let you walk away. You can disappear into whatever hole you crawled from, spend the gold you've already been paid, and live to see next winter. That's the deal. Take it or die here. We have the leverage, the leader insisted. We have her. You have a corpse the moment you hurt her. That's not leverage. That's suicide with extra steps. The mercenaries exchanged glances. Professional killers calculating odds. One of them spoke up. We were paid by House Ravarin. Lady Selene herself hired us. Said to make it look like you'd sacrifice imperial stability to protect her. Proof for the other lords that you were compromised. So Selene hadn't accepted rejection quietly. She'd decided to force the point by creating an impossible choice and watching him make it. The leader still held his knife to Cerys's throat. "Even if we tell you this, what's to stop you killing us anyway?" "My word," Vaelor said, "which is worth considerably more than whatever Ravarin paid you." The silence stretched. Then slowly, the mercenary lowered his blade. "Smart choice," Vaelor said. They released Cerys. She stumbled forward and Vaelor caught her, pulling her behind him in one smooth motion while keeping his eyes on the mercenaries. "Go," he told them. "And tell Celine that her plan didn't work. Tell her that I can care about someone and still be dangerous. In fact, tell her I'm more dangerous now because I have something worth protecting." The mercenaries mounted and rode hard for the tree line. Thorn arrived with reinforcements 3 minutes later. "Your Majesty, Corvine's escaped. He had fresh horses waiting in the northern pass. By the time we realized, he was gone." Vaelor looked at Cerys, checking the thin cut on her throat. Superficial. She'd survive. "Let him run," Vaelor said. "He accomplished what he wanted. Proof that I'll abandon pursuit to protect her. That's going to spread. Every lord in the Empire will hear about this." "Is that a problem?" Thorn asked carefully. Vaelor considered it. "Depends on how we frame it. Either I'm compromised and vulnerable, or I'm resourceful enough to protect what matters while still being the most dangerous force they'll ever face. We just need to make sure the second interpretation is the one that sticks." "How?" "By making an example of House Ravarin that's so brutal, so complete, that everyone understands. Threatening her doesn't give you leverage. It guarantees annihilation." Cerys touched his arm. "Vaelor, that's necessary," he interrupted. "You think I'm overreacting? They hired mercenaries to put a knife to your throat. They tried to use you to break me, to prove I was weak. Every house in the Empire is watching to see if I let that stand. If I do, you'll never be safe. There will always be another conspiracy, another attempt to exploit what they perceive as weakness." "So you're going to destroy an entire house because they threatened me?" "I'm going to destroy an entire house because they need to understand the cost. This isn't revenge, Cerys. It's communication. I'm sending a message in the only language these people understand: overwhelming, unquestionable, permanent consequence." She looked at him with something between fear and recognition. "You're not the man you were a week ago." "No. That man would have sacrificed you to maintain strategic advantage. This man is going to sacrifice House Ravarin to ensure you never face that blade again. Is that better or worse? I honestly don't know, but it's who I am now." The ride back to Moonspire took 4 days. Vaelor spent them planning, not battle strategy. That part was simple. House Ravarin's estates were concentrated in the southern valleys, defensible but not impregnable. He'd need 2 legions, maybe 3. Swift assault, capture the family holdings, seize assets before they could be moved or hidden. The complex part was managing the message, because this wasn't about military conquest. It was about making every noble in Nerith understand that threatening Cerys was suicide. That attachment hadn't made him weak. It had made him absolutely unforgiving of anyone who tried to exploit it. Cerys rode beside him, quiet and thoughtful. On the 3rd night, camped in the borderlands, she finally spoke her mind. "You're going to kill them. All of them. Not all. Lord Arcturus and Lady Celine, certainly. Anyone directly involved in the conspiracy. The rest will be exiled, stripped of titles, their wealth redistributed. That's annihilation. That's justice. They tried to use you as a weapon against me. They put a knife to your throat to prove a political point. What would you have me do? Send a strongly worded letter? I'd have you consider the precedent you're setting. That anyone who threatens someone you care about gets destroyed completely. That's not governance. That's tyranny driven by personal vendetta." Her words hit harder than he wanted to admit. "Maybe," he said slowly, "but the alternative is worse. If I show mercy here, if I let this stand with minimal consequence, then every ambitious house in the Empire will know exactly how to manipulate me. They'll see you as my weakness, the pressure point that forces concessions. You'll never be safe. I'll spend the rest of my reign protecting you from schemes designed to exploit my attachment. So your solution is to terrify everyone so completely that they never try?" "Yes, exactly that." Cerys was silent for a long moment. "That's the old philosophy," she said finally. "Dominance through fear. Control through overwhelming threat. I thought we were trying to build something different." We are. But different doesn't mean defenseless. I can govern with humanity and still be brutal toward people who threaten what I care about. Those aren't contradictory, they're complementary. The Empire needs to know I'm capable of both tenderness and annihilation, depending on how you approach me. And if that makes you into exactly the kind of tyrant you swore never to become, then I'll be a tyrant with you alive beside me, instead of a just ruler standing over your corpse. I can live with that trade. Can you, though? Really? Her question landed in the space between them like something fragile and sharp. Vaelor stared at the campfire. I don't know, he admitted. A week ago, I had clarity. I knew who I was, what I stood for, how to make decisions. Now I'm improvising, reacting, building new philosophy in real time while trying to hold an empire together. Maybe I am becoming a tyrant. Maybe attachment has compromised my judgment in ways I can't even see yet. But the alternative, going back to who I was before, feels impossible now. That version of me is dead. He died when they came for you. So what are you now? He looked at her. Honestly? Terrified. I'm a ruler who's supposed to have answers, and I don't have any. I'm making choices based on instinct instead of strategy. Choosing protection over optimality. And everyone's watching to see if it works, or if I collapse like my father did. Your father collapsed because he was alone, Saris said. Because no one gave him permission to be both grieving and functional. You have me. You have Thorn. You have an empire you built through capability that doesn't evaporate just because you admitted to caring about someone. She leaned closer. But you need to hear this. If you annihilate House Raverin purely as retribution for threatening me, you're not sending a message about strength. You're confirming everyone's worst fears about attachment compromising your judgment. You're proving that emotion has replaced strategy, and that will invite more challenges, not fewer. Then what should I do? Respond proportionally. Yes, House Raverin needs to face consequences for hiring assassins and destabilizing the Empire. But total annihilation? That's your fear talking, not your strategy. Your fear that if you're not overwhelmingly brutal, someone will hurt me. That fear is valid, but letting it drive policy makes you predictable, exploitable. He hated that she was right. So I should show mercy, not mercy, justice. Strip their titles, seize assets proportional to their crimes, exile the family leadership. Make it hurt without making it genocide. Demonstrate that you're still capable of measured response even when personally invested. And if they interpret that as weakness, then you have the rest of your reign to prove otherwise. But at least you'll have a reign built on something other than terror. They sat in silence while the fire crackled. How did you get so wise about governance? Vaelor asked eventually. I'm not wise about governance. I'm wise about people. And right now, you're a person who's terrified of becoming his father, so terrified that you're overcorrecting toward the opposite extreme. You're trying to prove you can care and still be brutal. But maybe what you actually need to prove is that you can care and still be measured. That's harder. Most worthwhile things are. The next morning, Vaelor called his commanders together and revised the assault plan. Instead of total annihilation, they'd conduct a precise military operation. Capture Lord Arcturus and Lady Selene for trial. Seize House Ravarin's military assets and wealth. Exile the family from imperial territory. Proportional response to treason and attempted assassination. His commanders looked confused. Sir, they tried to kill Lady Vael, one captain pointed out. And they'll face consequences for it, Vaelor said. But consequences that demonstrate I'm still capable of measured judgment. That personal investment hasn't turned me into a reactive tyrant. We send a message, yes, but a message about controlled strength, not fear-driven brutality. Thorn studied him carefully. When did you decide this? Last night, after a conversation that reminded me I'm supposed to be better than my worst instincts. The army reached House Ravarin's territories within 2 days. The assault was surgical. Vaelor's forces surrounded the main estate at dawn, captured Arcturus and Selene before they could flee, and secured all strategic assets within 4 hours. Minimal bloodshed, maximum efficiency. By sunset, House Ravarin no longer existed as a political force. They brought Arcturus and Selene before Vaelor in the estate's great hall. Both were in chains, surrounded by guards, stripped of the arrogance they'd worn like armor in Moonspire. Selene spoke first. You're making a mistake. The other lords will see this as proof that I can respond to treason without losing control. Yes, that's exactly what I want them to see. You've chosen her over the Empire. I've integrated her into my governance. There's a difference. You assumed attachment would make me weak, exploitable. Instead, it's made me more focused, more determined. You gave me a reason to be better at this. Arcturus laughed bitterly. Better? You've abandoned every principle you built this empire on. Dominance without sentiment, control without compromise. Your father's weakness. My father, Vaelor interrupted, loved someone completely and lost himself when she died. I learned from that. Not the lesson you think, though. The lesson isn't to avoid attachment. It's to build systems strong enough to survive when attachment affects you. He gestured to the guards. You'll both face trial in Moonspire for treason and conspiracy to commit murder. Your family will be exiled from imperial territory, your lands redistributed, your wealth seized, but you'll live. That's the difference between the king you thought I was and the king I'm becoming. That's mercy, Celine spat. That's strategy. Mercy would be forgiveness. This is proportional consequence, and it's the last time anyone threatens her without facing annihilation. Consider yourselves lucky I chose measured response. Next person who tries won't be. They dragged House Raverin away. Saris approached from where she'd been watching. That was hard for you, she observed. Every instinct screamed to kill them, to make an example so brutal that no one would ever threaten you again. But you didn't. No. Because you were right. Terror is easy. Measured justice is harder. And if I'm going to prove that attachment hasn't compromised my capability, I need to demonstrate I'm still capable of the harder choice. She took his hand. The Empire's going to test you, over and over. Every lord, every house, every ambitious noble is going to probe for weakness. This decision will be analyzed, debated, used against you. Let them. I'm done governing according to other people's expectations. From now on, I rule based on what actually produces stable, sustainable empire. And that includes being human enough to care about outcomes beyond pure dominance. They left House Ravarin's territories the next morning. The ride back to Moonspire felt different, lighter somehow, despite the political turmoil waiting for them. But 3 days from the capital, a messenger intercepted their column. Urgent from the palace, he gasped. The Imperial Council has convened without your authority. They're debating your fitness to rule. Vaelor felt ice settle in his chest. On what grounds? That recent decisions demonstrate compromised judgment. That attachment has made you vulnerable in ways that endanger imperial stability. Lord Corvin's escape, the reduced sentence for House Raverin, the prioritization of Lady Vale's safety over military advantage, they're building a case for temporary regency until you prove capability. Saris looked stricken. This is because of me. This is because ambitious men saw opportunity, Vaelor corrected. They've been waiting for excuse. I gave them several. What do we do? Thorn asked. We ride hard for Moonspire, and I remind the Council exactly who holds power in this empire. They covered 3 days of distance in 2, pushing horses to exhaustion. The capital appeared on the horizon like a promise and a threat. Moonspire Palace gleamed with its usual menace and beauty. But the political atmosphere had changed. Vaelor could feel it the moment they passed through the city gates. Tension in the air, guards watching him with uncertainty instead of absolute confidence. Nobles gathering in clusters, measuring risk, calculating allegiance. The empire was fracturing, and he'd caused it by choosing her. The Imperial Council was in session when Vaelor entered the Grand War Hall. 24 lords and military commanders sat in heated debate. They fell silent as their king appeared, still in travel-stained armor, with Saris beside him. Lord Marcellus, the council's eldest member, stood. Your Majesty, we didn't expect you back so soon. I didn't expect to find my council convening without royal authority. That's called treason, Marcellus. We prefer the term intervention. Your recent decisions have raised concerns about compromised judgment. We're here to discuss. You're here to measure whether you can unseat me, Vaelor cut him off. Let's be honest about it. You think attachment has made me weak. Think I've abandoned the philosophy that built this empire. And you're wondering if you can exploit that perceived weakness to install someone more controllable. The council exchanged uncomfortable glances. No one's questioning your capabilities, another lord said carefully. You're literally debating my fitness to rule. That's definitional questioning. He walked to the center of the hall. So let's have it out. All of you. Every concern, every criticism, every fear about what I've become. Right now. No politics, no careful wording, just truth. Silence. Then Lord Castan spoke up, the young Eastern lord who'd defended Ceres before. We're afraid, he said simply. Afraid that you're becoming your father. That attachment will break you the same way it broke him. And if you break, the Empire breaks with you. Valid fear, Vaelor acknowledged. My father loved my mother completely. When she died, it destroyed him, nearly destroyed Nerith in the process. I spent 20 years building my rule on the lesson that attachment was terminal weakness. So yes, by changing that philosophy, by choosing her, I've terrified everyone who depends on me being invulnerable. He looked around the hall. But here's what you're missing. My father didn't break because he loved someone. He broke because when she died, he had no infrastructure of support, no culture that permitted grief and functionality to coexist. He was alone in his devastation, and that isolation killed him as surely as the loss itself. He gestured to the council. I'm not alone. I have commanders, advisors, a council full of capable people. More importantly, I've built an empire on military genius and strategic capability that doesn't evaporate because I care about someone. Attachment doesn't compromise competence unless you let it, and I'm not letting it. Marcellus shook his head. Pretty words. But Lord Corvin escaped because you prioritized Lady Vael's safety over pursuit. House Raverin received reduced sentence because she advocated mercy. Every decision since the renewal rite has been influenced by personal attachment. How is that not compromise? It's not compromise, it's integration, Vaelor said. Yes, I abandoned pursuit to protect her. And yes, I chose measured response instead of annihilation partly because she convinced me. But both decisions were strategically sound. Letting Corvin escape sent a message about priorities that's more useful than his capture would have been. And measured response to Raverin demonstrates I'm still capable of proportional judgment. Those are features, not bugs, the council murmured. Ceres stepped forward then. May I speak? The hall went quiet. She was technically allowed. Ancient law permitted consorts to address councils during governance discussions, but no one had expected her to use that right. Please, Marcellus said carefully. You're all debating whether caring about me has compromised his capability, Ceres said. But none of you are asking the more important question. Whether capability without humanity was actually sustainable long-term. She faced the council. King Vaelor built this empire through pure dominance, fear, control, strategic brilliance. It worked, but it also created a culture where the only path to power was to strip away everything soft, everything human. That's not sustainable. Eventually, rulers built on nothing but control become brittle. They fracture under pressures they can't dominate their way through. She paused. He's not weaker now, he's more complete. Yes, personal attachment influences his decisions, but those influences make him more invested in building sustainable systems, not just winning immediate conflicts. You're so focused on the supposed vulnerability that you're missing the actual advantage. A king who's motivated by something beyond legacy and conquest. One who might actually create an empire worth living in, not just surviving under. The silence that followed her words felt heavy with consideration. Then General Thorne spoke. His voice carried weight earned through 40 years of military service. I've served under King Vaelor for 2 decades, he said. I've watched him conquer territories, crush rebellions, expand this empire into the dominant force in the northern regions. And I can tell you with absolute certainty, he's a better commander now than he was a month ago. The council stirred. Better? Marcellus challenged. More focused, Thorne clarified. More invested in outcomes. Before he fought because that's what kings do. Now he fights because he's protecting something specific. That clarity of purpose makes him dangerous in ways pure dominance never achieved. I wouldn't bet against him. Not before, and definitely not now. Other commanders nodded agreement. Vaelor let them debate for another hour. Let them voice every fear, every concern, every worst-case scenario about attachment compromising empire. Then he called for silence. You want to know if I'm fit to rule? Here's your test. I'm going to govern exactly as I have been, with capability and humanity integrated. Attachment informing but not controlling my decisions. And if that approach fails, if it produces the collapse you're all afraid of, then you'll have grounds to remove me. But until then, you follow my authority. Not because I'm forcing obedience, but because I've earned it through every conquest, every expansion, every time I've proven myself the most capable force in this empire. He looked each council member in the eye. Anyone who can't accept those terms, leave now. Take your lands, your titles, your ambitions elsewhere. I'll govern the houses that remain, and we'll see which version of empire actually survives, one built purely on domination or one that includes space for being human. No one moved. Then we're done here, Vaelor said. This council is dismissed, and if you convene again without my authority, I'll consider it actual treason instead of misguided intervention. The nobles departed slowly, uncertainty written across their faces. When the hall cleared, only Vaelor, Ceres, and Thorn remained. That was reckless, Thorn observed. Probably, Vaelor agreed, but necessary. I needed them to understand I'm not negotiating about who I am anymore. They accept the integrated version or they leave. And if they test you, push boundaries to see if attachment really has compromised your judgment, then I demonstrate otherwise, repeatedly, until the message sinks in. Ceres touched his arm. You just bet everything on being able to prove them wrong. Yes. Which means I need to actually be right. Need to govern so effectively that attachment becomes advantage instead of liability. Can you do that? Vaelor looked at her. I don't know, but I'm going to try. Because the alternative, going back to who I was, isn't an option anymore. That man is dead. This is who I am now. Whoever that is. They stood in the empty hall while evening light faded through stained glass windows. And somewhere in the political calculations happening throughout the empire, in the conversations between nobles and commanders, in the debates about their king's fitness to rule, a new narrative was beginning. That King Vaelor Draven had chosen attachment over empire. That he'd compromised his judgment for a healer. That vulnerability had finally found its way into the Iron Sovereign. What they didn't understand yet was that vulnerability wasn't weakness. It was motivation. And motivated rulers were far more dangerous than perfect ones had ever been. The message burned in Vaelor's hand like a brand. He stood alone in his private chambers while moonlight carved shadows across marble floors. Ceres slept in the adjoining room, exhausted from days of political warfare. The palace around him hummed with the false peace of midnight. Guards changing shifts, servants banking fires, the empire pretending everything was stable. But that single sentence had shattered the illusion. Your father made the same choice. The sickness that took your mother was no accident. Vaelor read it again. The parchment was expensive, the handwriting educated. Whoever sent this had access to palace deliveries and knowledge of events from 26 years ago. Knowledge that implied his mother's death, the foundational trauma that had shaped his entire philosophy of rulership, had been manufactured. Someone had killed her to test whether love would break his father. And now that same someone was testing whether it would break him. The implications cascaded through his mind like dominoes toppling in perfect sequence. Every conspiracy, every assassination attempt, every challenge to his authority since he'd chosen Ceres, none of it was organic resistance. It was orchestration, a deliberate campaign to create the exact circumstances that had destroyed his father, which meant someone had been planning this for decades. Vaelor's hand shook, not from fear but from rage so pure it felt like ice in his veins. He needed answers. The palace archives were 3 levels below the main structure, carved into bedrock and guarded by veterans who'd served long enough to remember his father's reign. Vaelor descended alone, using passages that bypassed public corridors. The head archivist was a woman named Eltris, 70 years old and sharp as broken glass. She looked up from ancient texts when Vaelor entered. Your Majesty, it's past midnight. I need records for my father's reign, specifically the year my mother died. Medical reports, council minutes, anything documenting her illness. Eltris studied him with eyes that had seen too many kings to be impressed by crowns. Those records are sealed. Your father's order before he passed said they were too painful to remain accessible. I'm unsealing them. Now. She didn't argue, just led him deeper into the archives where older documents lived in climate-controlled darkness. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency through filing systems that predated current organization. "Here," she said, pulling a leather-bound volume. Queen Alara's medical documentation. The chief healer at the time was Master Torvald. He documented everything. Vaelor opened the volume. The entries started innocuous. Minor ailments, seasonal fatigue, nothing alarming. Then 6 months before her death, the tone changed. Sudden onset of weakness, unexplained fever, progressive deterioration that defied every treatment. Master Torvald's frustration bled through his clinical notes. "I cannot identify the root cause. The symptoms suggest poisoning, but no toxin I test for appears in her blood. It's as if her body is attacking itself without external catalyst." Vaelor's blood went cold. 3 weeks before her death, a new entry appeared in different handwriting. Consultation with visiting physician from the Eastern Territories, Dr. Malthus Kael. He claims familiarity with rare conditions that mimic poisoning. Recommended treatment protocol attached. The treatment protocol was detailed, complex, involving herbs and compounds Vaelor recognized from his own military medical training. Nothing obviously dangerous, but the timing was wrong. His mother had died 2 weeks after this treatment began. "Do we have records of this, Dr. Kael?" Vaelor asked. Eltrus checked cross-references. Visiting physician, sponsored by... She paused. Lord Arcturus Ravarin. He vouched for Dr. Kael's credentials and arranged his access to the palace. The rage that had been cold turned molten. Ravarin, the same house that had just tried to use Ceres against him, the same house his father had trusted completely in the months after his mother's death, when grief had made King Aldrich vulnerable to political manipulation. The conspiracy wasn't new, it was generational. Vaelor spent the rest of the night in the archives, pulling every document connected to Ravarin's influence during his father's reign. The pattern emerged like a disease. After Queen Alara died, Lord Arcturus had become King Aldrich's closest advisor, had guided every major decision during the period of grief-induced weakness, had slowly shifted imperial policy toward benefiting southern territories and Ravarin interests, had nearly succeeded in arranging a marriage between young Vaelor and Arcturus's eldest daughter, a union that would have given House Ravarin dynastic access to the throne. That plan had collapsed when Aldrich died, and 14-year-old Vaelor took power with a philosophy built on never trusting anyone enough to be manipulated by their loss. So Ravarin had waited, 20 years of patience, watching Vaelor build an empire on isolation and dominance, waiting for the moment he'd make himself vulnerable again. And when Vaelor had chosen Ceres, Ravarin had struck. Not to destroy him immediately, but to recreate the exact conditions that had broken his father. Make him choose between attachment and empire. Force him into positions where personal feeling compromised strategic judgment. Prove that love was fatal weakness. Then seize power in the chaos that followed. The elegance of it made Vaelor sick. Dawn found him still in the archives, surrounded by evidence of a conspiracy that spanned his entire life. Eltrus had stayed with him, pulling documents, connecting threads. "Your father knew," she said quietly. Near the end, he suspected. There are notes in his private journals about House Ravarin's unusual influence, about feeling manipulated during his grief. But by then, he was too far gone. The depression had taken root. He couldn't muster the will to investigate or act. So he just gave up. He was broken, Your Majesty. Utterly. The woman he loved was dead, possibly murdered, and he'd let her killers whisper in his ear while he grieved. The guilt and grief combined destroyed him. He died knowing he'd failed her and the Empire both. Vaelor felt something crack inside him. His father hadn't been weak. He'd been murdered too, just more slowly, psychologically dismantled by the same people who'd killed his queen, and they were trying to do it again. "Where's Arcturus Ravarin being held?" Vaelor asked. "The Eastern Prison Tower. Awaiting trial. Cancel the trial. I'm executing him today." Eltrus's eyes widened. "Your Majesty, you promised proportional justice. The Council can witness exactly what happens to people who orchestrate generational conspiracies to destroy my family." He left the archives with evidence clutched in his hands and murder in his heart. Ceres found him in the armory, selecting blades. "What are you doing?" "Preparing to execute a traitor." "Vaelor, we talked about this. Measured response, proportional justice. That was before I discovered he killed my mother. He told her everything. The records, the visiting physician, the decades-long manipulation, watched her face shift from concern to horror. If this is true, she said carefully, then yes, he needs to face consequences. But summary execution? That's not justice, that's revenge. And it confirms everything your enemies are saying about attachment compromising your judgment. He murdered my mother to break my father, spent 20 years waiting to try again with me. He put a knife to your throat as part of a conspiracy that started before I was born. What proportional response exists for that? A trial, Saris insisted. Public presentation of evidence. Let the Empire see the full scope of his crimes and judge accordingly. If you execute him in rage, you look like exactly what they fear, a king controlled by emotion instead of reason. I am controlled by emotion. I'm furious. He killed her, Saris. Poisoned her slowly while pretending to be my father's ally. Let him weep over her corpse, knowing he'd been manipulated by her murderers. That's evil on a scale that doesn't deserve measured response. Then be better than your fury, she said. Be the king who's capable of justice, even when everything in him screams for vengeance. That's the real test. Not whether you can care about people, but whether you can govern effectively despite how much you care. Her words cut through rage like cold water. He wanted to argue. Wanted to explain that some crimes transcended procedural justice. That Arcturus Ravarin deserved to die choking on his own blood in a dark cell with no ceremony or dignity. But she was right. Summary execution would confirm every fear the council had voiced, would prove that attachment had compromised his capability for measured judgment, would validate the exact narrative Ravarin's conspiracy was designed to create. The bastard had planned for this too, had known that discovery would trigger rage, that rage would trigger poor decisions, that poor decisions would trigger imperial collapse. Every possible response was a trap. Fine, Vaelor said. Public trial. Full evidence presented. The Empire watches him condemned by his own conspiracy. Thank you. But after he's condemned, after the trial concludes and justice is served, I'm the one who executes him. Personally, that's not negotiable. Saris looked at him for a long moment. Okay. The trial of Lord Arcturus Ravarin began 3 days later in the Grand War Hall. Every noble house in Nerith sent representatives. The gallery filled with hundreds of witnesses, all of them watching to see how their king handled the revelation that his mother's death had been orchestrated assassination. Vaelor sat on the throne in full ceremonial armor. Saris stood beside him in formal healer's robes, visible, present, undeniable. A statement that he wasn't hiding his attachment or pretending it didn't exist. General Thorne served as prosecutor, presenting evidence with military precision. The records were damning. Medical documents showing the progression of Queen Alara's illness. Cross-references to similar cases documented in obscure medical texts. All of them deliberate poisoning designed to mimic natural disease. Financial records showing payments from House Ravarin to Dr. Malthus Kael. Correspondence between Arcturus and Kael discussing timeline and dosage. It had been premeditated murder over the course of months, slow enough to seem like illness, painful enough to break the king who loved her. The gallery sat in stunned silence as each piece of evidence landed. Arcturus Ravarin stood in chains at the center of it all, gray-bearded and defiant. When Thorne finished, Vaelor spoke. Lord Ravarin, you are accused of orchestrating the murder of Queen Vaelor Draven 26 years ago, of manipulating my father during his grief to advance your house's interests, of attempting to repeat that conspiracy by targeting Lady Saris Vael. How do you answer these charges? Arcturus met his gaze without flinching. Guilty on all counts. The admission sent shockwaves through the hall. The old lord continued, his voice carrying across shocked silence. Your mother was an obstacle to proper imperial governance. Your father loved her so completely that he consulted her on matters of state. Let personal feeling influence strategic decisions. That weakness nearly destroyed Nerith during the border wars. He hesitated to commit forces because she advised mercy. Good men died because their king was compromised by attachment. Vaelor's hands gripped the throne arms hard enough to make stone creak. So you killed her. I saved the Empire. Your father's grief made him useless for a time, yes, but it also taught you the most important lesson of your reign, that attachment is fatal weakness. You built this empire on that lesson. Expanded territories, crushed rebellions, became the most feared ruler in the northern regions. All because you learned not to let personal feeling compromise judgment. He smiled. I made you, Vaelor, the Iron King who conquered through pure dominance. That's my creation, born from your mother's death and your father's collapse. You owe your entire philosophy of governance to my actions. The hall erupted in outrage. Nobles shouted, guards moved forward, but Vaelor raised a hand for silence. You killed my mother to teach me a lesson about attachment? I killed your mother to save the empire from a weak king. And when you started making the same mistake, choosing that healer over political advantage, I attempted the same correction. But you proved more resilient than your father, stronger, which is interesting because it suggests the lesson took root deeper than I expected. Arcturus looked around the hall. All of you watching, you're terrified he's become his father. That attachment will break him the same way. But I've given him something his father never had, awareness. He knows what I did, knows the cost of letting personal feeling rule. Now he has to decide whether the woman beside him is worth risking everything I taught him. Ceres went pale. Vaelor felt her flinch even though they stood 3 feet apart, because that's the real test, Arcturus continued. Not whether he can kill me, of course he can. I'm chained and condemned, but whether he can look at her and not see the threat she represents, whether every time she speaks he'll hear his mother's voice advising mercy that gets people killed, whether he can trust his own judgment when she influences it. He leaned forward in his chains. I've made her toxic, your majesty. Every noble in this hall now associates her with your greatest vulnerability, with the weakness that got your mother murdered and your father destroyed. You can execute me, but you can't execute that association. She'll always be the reminder of what attachment costs, the living symbol of your potential downfall. The silence that followed was absolute. Vaelor stood slowly. You've made a critical miscalculation, he said. You assumed the lesson you taught me was about avoiding attachment. That weakness killed empires, so rulers must remain isolated. But that's not what I learned from my father's death. He descended from the throne. What I learned was that you're evil, that people like you exist, manipulators who see human connection as exploitable weakness rather than fundamental strength, who murder queens and break kings and call it saving empires. My father's flaw wasn't loving my mother. It was trusting you while he grieved. Vaelor stopped 10 feet from Arcturus. You want me to see Ceres as threat? As the vulnerability that will destroy me? But the only threat in this room is you and every piece of shit like you who thinks attachment is weakness to be exploited rather than humanity to be protected. My father didn't die because he loved. He died because he let your poison into his mind after you'd taken her from him. I'm not making that mistake. Arcturus smiled coldly. We'll see. Because the conspiracy doesn't end with me. There are others who've learned the same lesson, that targeting what rulers care about is the most effective form of control. And now everyone knows she's your pressure point. They'll come for her, Vaelor, again and again. And each time, you'll have to choose between protecting her and protecting Empire. Eventually, you'll choose wrong. Or eventually, I'll kill everyone who tries. Let that be the lesson, Arcturus. Not that attachment is weakness, but that exploiting it is fatal. You're about to be the example. He turned to the assembly. Lord Arcturus Ravarin is guilty of regicide, conspiracy, and attempted murder spanning multiple decades. The sentence is death by beheading. Execution at sunset. The entire empire will watch what happens to people who manipulate grief and target what rulers care about. The hall erupted in response, some approving, some shocked, all processing the revelation that their king's entire philosophy had been shaped by orchestrated murder. Vaelor returned to the throne. This trial is concluded. Lord Ravarin will be held in the Eastern Tower until execution. Any house caught communicating with him between now and then will be considered co-conspirators. They dragged Arcturus away. He went without struggle, still smiling that cold smile. When the hall cleared, Ceres approached carefully. He's trying to poison you against me. Make you afraid that caring about me will get me killed. I know. Is it working? Vaelor looked at her. Yes, he admitted. Every word he said is tactically true. You are my vulnerability now. Every ambitious house knows it. They'll use you against me until one of them succeeds or I kill them all. And the paranoia of trying to protect you while governing effectively might destroy me more surely than any external threat. So what do? We survive it, together. We build structures strong enough that even when I'm compromised by fear for your safety, the Empire continues functioning. We prove that attachment doesn't have to be fatal weakness if you're strategic about protecting it. Can that actually work? I have no idea. But the alternative is letting Arcturus's poison work, letting fear drive us apart because staying together is dangerous. And I'm done letting that bastard dictate my choices. That evening, as sunset approached, the execution grounds filled with witnesses. The entire Imperial Council attended, representatives from every major house, common citizens admitted to public galleries. This wasn't just execution, it was theater, a demonstration of consequences. They brought Arcturus to the platform in chains. He showed no fear, just that same cold calculation he'd worn in the trial. Vaelor stood waiting with a headsman's blade. He'd dismissed the professional executioner. This death he'd deliver personally. Any final words, he asked? Arcturus met his eyes. I destroyed you before you were born, he said calmly, shaped your entire worldview through tragedy orchestrated before you had memory. Every decision you've made as king traces back to what I took from you. And now, killing me, you prove you've learned the lesson. That ruthlessness matters more than mercy. That attachment must be protected through overwhelming violence. He smiled. You think you're different from your father, but you're just a more brutal version of the same weakness. He crumbled when she died. You'll crumble trying to keep her alive. Either way, attachment destroys you. I've won regardless of outcome. Vaelor raised the blade. You've won nothing. You've just taught me exactly how far I'll go to protect what I care about. Everyone watching now understands. Threatening her doesn't give you leverage. It guarantees annihilation. That's the message. That's the deterrent. Is it? Because I see a king so compromised by fear that he's executing a chained old man to send a message. That's not strength. That's terror pretending to be justice. The blade fell. Lord Arcturus Raverin died instantly, his head separating clean. The crowd exhaled as one, some in approval, some in horror. Vaelor stood over the body feeling nothing but emptiness. The satisfaction he'd expected didn't materialize, just hollow completion of necessary brutality. He turned to the assembly. Let this be the example. House Raverin conspired across generations to manipulate this empire through targeting what rulers cared about. That ends today. Any house that attempts similar manipulation faces identical consequences. The empire will not be controlled through exploiting attachment. He paused. I'm done pretending attachment is weakness that needs hiding. Done isolating myself to avoid vulnerability. Instead, I'm building governance that integrates humanity with capability, that protects what matters while maintaining strategic effectiveness. You can accept that or leave. Your choice. The assembly watched in silence. Vaelor left the execution grounds with Cerys beside him. Blood on his hands, exhaustion in his bones, and the hollow knowledge that Arcturus's final words contained more truth than he wanted to admit. He was terrified, absolutely, of failing her, of the Empire using her against him, of becoming so paranoid about her safety that he stopped being effective as ruler. The old philosophy had been simple: don't care, can't be manipulated. The new reality was complex: care deeply, be constantly vulnerable, somehow govern effectively despite that vulnerability. And he had no idea if it was sustainable. 3 weeks passed. The Empire settled into uneasy new normalcy. House Raverin's territories were redistributed. The conspiracy's exposure forced other noble houses to recalibrate their approaches to the throne. Some adapted, accepting that their king's attachment was permanent feature rather than temporary vulnerability. Others started planning. Vaelor felt it happening. The shift from overt challenge to subtle erosion. Nobles who smiled at court while scheming in private. Allies who offered support while calculating betrayal. The machinery of conspiracy grinding forward despite Arcturus's execution. Because Arcturus had been right about one thing, everyone now knew Cerys was pressure point, and pressure points got exploited. Vaelor started sleeping less, checking guard rotations obsessively, questioning every food taster, every servant with access to her chambers. The paranoia Arcturus had warned about began taking root. Cerys noticed. You're drowning, she said one night when she found him reviewing security protocols at 3 in the morning. I'm being thorough. You're being terrified. Vaelor, you can't govern like this. Can't spend every waking moment calculating threats to my safety. Someone has to. We have guards. Entire security infrastructure. You hired the best commanders in the Empire. Let them do their jobs while you do yours. My job includes keeping you alive. Your job is ruling Nerith. That's bigger than me. He slammed the documents down. Don't tell me you're not worth protecting. Don't feed me that self-sacrificing nobility where you minimize your own value. You're the only person in this empire who sees me as human instead of weapon. That's worth any amount of security infrastructure. Even if the paranoia destroys your capability to govern? The question hung between them. Because that's what's happening, she continued. You're so focused on potential threats that you're missing actual governance. The northern provinces need trade agreements reviewed. The eastern territories are disputing border definitions. Your council has requested 3 audiences you've postponed. You're letting the empire drift because you're obsessed with my safety. Then help me balance it. Tell me how to care about you and govern effectively simultaneously. I don't know. But I know this isn't working. She moved closer. Maybe Arcturus was right. Maybe my presence does make you vulnerable in ways that compromise your effectiveness. And if that's true, maybe I should... Don't, Vaelor interrupted. Don't finish that sentence. Don't suggest leaving because it's easier. We've come too far to let fear drive strategy now. But what if fear is the appropriate response? What if the rational calculation is that I'm too much liability? Then I'd rather be irrational and effective enough to protect you than rational and alone. That's the choice I've made. Even if it costs the Empire, it won't come to that. How do you know? Because I won't let it. The confidence in his voice sounded hollow even to himself. 2 days later, reality proved him wrong. General Thorne burst into the council chamber during routine session. Your Majesty, we have the situation. The southern border fortresses report coordinated uprising across 4 provinces. Different houses, synchronized timing. They're demanding your abdication in favor of a regency council. The room went silent. How many troops are we talking about? Vaelor asked. Combined? Roughly 40,000. They've been planning this for months, stockpiling weapons and coordinating communication. This isn't random rebellion, it's organized coup attempt. Can we put it down? With time and resources, yes, but it'll require deploying most of our military forces to the southern territories, leaving Moonspire and the northern provinces relatively undefended for weeks, possibly months. Vaelor felt ice settle in his stomach. This is the play. They forced a choice. Suppress rebellion or maintain capital security. Either way, something critical goes undefended. It's worse than that, Thorne said. We've intercepted communications between the rebel houses. They're not actually trying to win military conflict. They're trying to draw your forces away from Moonspire so that... He trailed off, looking at Saris. So that what? She asked. So that a secondary team can infiltrate the capital while defenses are weakened and eliminate the king's vulnerability. They're not trying to beat you on battlefield, Your Majesty. They're trying to kill her while you're distracted fighting their rebellion. The council erupted in overlapping voices, strategy suggestions, risk calculations, security recommendations. Vaelor heard none of it. This was the impossible choice made manifest. Suppress rebellion that threatened imperial stability, or protect the person whose safety mattered more than strategy. Exactly the scenario Arcturus had orchestrated, the test his father had failed. He looked at Saris and saw his own fear reflected in her eyes. What if they're right? She said quietly, barely audible under the council's debate. What if attachment really is fatal weakness, and we've been deluding ourselves that it could be strength? Then we're both fools, Vaelor replied. But we're committed fools. Committed to what? Watching the Empire burn while we protect our personal feelings? Committed to finding a third option that doesn't require choosing between you and everything else. And if no third option exists? The question demanded answer he didn't have. Because standing there in his council chamber with rebellion reports spreading across maps and 40,000 enemy troops forcing impossible choices, Vaelor realized the full scope of his miscalculation. He'd thought integrating attachment with governance meant being strategic about protection while maintaining effectiveness. But the Empire's enemies had adapted faster than his defenses, had learned to target not through direct assault but through forcing exactly these situations, where any choice validated that attachment was compromise. Fight the rebellion, she dies. Stay to protect her, the rebellion spreads and proves he's compromised. There was no third option. Just the brutal mathematics of being a ruler who'd made himself vulnerable. Arcturus's final words echoed in his mind. You'll crumble trying to keep her alive. Maybe. Probably. But standing there, surrounded by military maps and impossible choices, Vaelor made a decision that would either save them both or destroy everything he'd built. He turned to his council. Here's what we're doing, he said. General Thorn takes command of the military response to Southern Rebellion. Full deployment, maximum force, crush them absolutely. Meanwhile, I stay in Moonspire with minimal guard force and bait the secondary team into attacking. The council stared. Bait? Thorn repeated. They want access to her while defenses are weak? I'm going to give it to them. Let them commit their assets to an assassination attempt. Then I kill them all, and we trace funding back to whichever houses are orchestrating this coup. 2 threats eliminated simultaneously. That's insane, a council member protested. You'd be deliberately making yourself and Lady Vael vulnerable. I'd be using their strategy against them. They think I'm compromised by fear for her safety. So I demonstrate the opposite, that I'm strategic enough to use her as bait when necessary. That attachment hasn't destroyed my capability for calculated risk. Saris looked at him with something between respect and horror. You're gambling with my life to prove a point. I'm gambling with both our lives to solve an unsolvable problem. If we do nothing, the rebellion spreads. If I deploy to stop it, you die. This is the only option that addresses both threats. It's reckless. It's calculated. There's a difference. Thorn studied the maps. It could work, he admitted reluctantly. If the assassination team believes defenses are genuinely weakened, they'll commit fully. Quality intelligence suggests roughly 20 operators. Elite, expensive, but finite. If you can neutralize them, we eliminate the secondary threat, and I can focus entirely on rebellion without worrying about capital security. He looked up. But if you're wrong, if there are more operators than intelligence suggests, or if they're better than our estimates, you and Lady Vael both die. That's the stakes. Understood. The room fell silent while everyone processed the insanity of their king deliberately making himself vulnerable to prove attachment hadn't compromised capability. Finally, Saris spoke. If we're doing this, I have conditions. Vaelor looked at her. I'm not passive bait, she said. You train me. Basic defense, situational awareness, how to survive if guards fall. I won't be helpless victim waiting for rescue. Done. What else? We tell no one beyond this room about the plan. The assassination team needs to genuinely believe we're vulnerable. That means accepting the Empire will think you've made catastrophic strategic error. Can you handle that perception? If it keeps you alive? Yes. Then we do this together. No hiding me in secure chambers while you face danger alone. We're bait together, or not at all. Vaelor wanted to argue. Every instinct screamed to lock her in the most defensible location while he handled threats. But that would defeat the purpose. Showing attachment hadn't destroyed his capability for strategic partnership. Together, he agreed. The council dispersed to implement the plan. Thorn left within hours, taking 80% of the palace guard and all mobile military forces. The Southern Rebellion would face overwhelming response that left no doubt about their king's military capability. Meanwhile, Moonspire transformed into deliberate vulnerability. Vaelor reduced guard rotations to minimum appearance, made the assassination team's job look achievable, set up monitoring to track infiltration attempts without tipping them off to surveillance, and started training Ceres to survive. The sessions were brutal. Vaelor pulled no punches about the reality she faced. Professional killers move fast and quiet, he explained during knife defense training. They won't announce themselves, won't give you time to think. Your body needs to react before your brain processes threat. He demonstrated attacks that made her flinch. Don't freeze, freezing kills you. Dodge, counter, scream for help, anything but freeze. She practiced until her hands bled, until muscle memory started replacing panic, until she could execute basic defensive movements without thought. But they both knew the truth. If the assassination team was competent and committed, basic training wouldn't save her. This was risk mitigation, not elimination. 4 days after Thorn departed, the first infiltration attempt occurred. 3 operators entered palace grounds through the eastern garden wall. Vaelor tracked their movement through surveillance while maintaining appearance of ignorance. Let them penetrate deeper, commit more resources, reveal the full scope of their assault plan. The attack came at midnight. Vaelor and Cerys were in his private chambers, the location intelligence had indicated as primary target. The attackers moved with professional efficiency, killing 2 guards silently before breaching the chamber entrance. Then they discovered their target waiting. Vaelor met them with drawn blade and absolute fury. The fight was short and vicious. Professional killers encountered a king who'd built his empire through personal combat expertise. 2 died in the first 30 seconds. The third managed to wound Cerys, shallow cut across her forearm, before Vaelor killed him. Silence descended. 3 bodies. Blood on marble floors. Cerys breathing hard but alive. "Is this all of them?" she asked. Vaelor checked the corpses. Professional gear, quality weapons, but nothing indicating larger operation. "Probably a probe," he said. "Testing defenses. The main assault will be larger. How many more of these attacks can we survive?" "As many as necessary." But the strain showed in his voice. The paranoia Arcturus had warned about was manifesting. Every shadow became threat. Every noise outside chambers triggered combat readiness. He wasn't sleeping, wasn't eating properly, wasn't governing anything beyond immediate survival. The Empire was drifting while he obsessed over protection. 3 days later, word arrived from the southern territories. General Thorn had crushed the rebellion. 40,000 troops defeated in coordinated military action that left no doubt about Nereth's military superiority. The rebel houses were surrendering, requesting terms, falling over themselves to reaffirm loyalty. Victory. Total and absolute. But Moonspire had received 2 more assassination attempts in Thorn's absence. 5 more operators dead. Cerys wounded twice more. Nothing life-threatening but accumulating damage. And Vaelor was operating on 3 hours of sleep over 4 days, seeing threats in every courtier, every servant, every movement outside his immediate sightline. He was collapsing exactly as Arcturus had predicted. When Thorn returned, he found his king barricaded in private chambers with minimal staff and maximum paranoia. "Your Majesty, we've won. The rebellion is crushed. We can restore normal security protocols." Vaelor barely processed the words. "Did you identify who funded them?" "House Malthus, House Corvin, and 3 minor families, all coordinating through intermediaries. We have confessions, documents, everything needed for prosecution. Execute them all. Leaders, conspirators, anyone involved." Thorn hesitated. "Sir, that's 37 people. Some were minor participants. Surely proportional justice." "I don't care about proportions." Vaelor's voice cracked. "They tried to kill her while I was defending against their rebellion. That's the crime. The punishment is death. Execute them." The room went silent. Cerys moved to his side. "Vaelor, look at me." He did. Her face was pale, exhaustion matching his own. Bandages on her arm from the latest attack. But her eyes were clear. "This isn't working," she said quietly. "We've proven you can fight and protect simultaneously. But the cost is destroying you. You're not governing. You're surviving. There's a difference. What would you have me do? Stop caring whether you live or die?" "No. But stop letting fear of my death paralyze your capability. You've built an empire on strategic brilliance. Use it. Find actual solutions instead of just reacting to threats." "I am using strategy. The problem is you're compromised," General Thorn said bluntly. "With respect, Your Majesty, this situation has exceeded your capability to manage. You need help. You need to delegate protection duties to professionals while you return to actual governance." Vaelor looked between them, his general and the woman he'd restructured his entire worldview to protect, and realized they were both right. He'd become exactly what he'd feared. A ruler so compromised by attachment that effectiveness had crumbled. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually through accumulated strain of trying to govern and protect simultaneously. Arcturus's final victory was playing out in real time. "What do I do?" he asked. His voice was quiet, defeated in a way Vaelor Draven had never sounded before. Cerys took his hand. "You make a choice, the one you've been avoiding since this started. Either you trust the infrastructure you've built, the guards, the commanders, the security systems, To protect me while you govern. Or you admit attachment has compromised you beyond recovery and find a different solution. What different solution? I leave Moonspire. Remove myself as target. Let you govern without the constant fear of my assassination pulling you away from strategy. The words hit like blade to the chest. No, he said immediately. Then you have to trust, really trust. Not just say you do while micromanaging every protection detail. Actually delegate security to professionals and return your attention to governing. And when the next assassination attempt succeeds because I wasn't personally overseeing defenses, then you survive it, grieve, and continue governing. Because that's what rulers do. They survive loss without crumbling. Your father couldn't do that. But you're not your father. I might be. She squeezed his hand. Only if you choose to be. The difference is choice. He never had it. Arcturus manipulated him during grief before he could develop coping structures. You have warning, infrastructure, people who can help carry the weight. You just have to accept help instead of trying to control everything personally. Vaelor looked at Thorn. Can you protect her? Actually protect her if I return to governing and stop micromanaging security? The general met his eyes. Yes. If you let me deploy resources properly instead of redirecting them to whatever immediate threat you've fixated on. I've been protecting rulers and their families for 40 years. I know how to do this, but I need your trust in your absence. Can you give both? Every instinct screamed no, screamed that delegation was abandonment, that trust was weakness, that the only way to ensure her safety was personal oversight of every detail. But those instincts had been shaped by Arcturus's conspiracy, born from orchestrated trauma designed to make attachment feel like fatal vulnerability. Vaelor looked at Ceres and saw exhaustion that matched his own, saw the strain of being both protected and burdened, saw a woman who'd stood beside him through conspiracies and assassination attempts and political warfare, asking him to trust that she could survive without him hovering. She was stronger than his paranoia gave her credit for. The Empire was crumbling while he obsessed over immediate threats, and Arcturus's poison was winning. All right, Vaelor said finally. Thorn, you have full authority over her security. Deploy resources as you see fit. I'll return to actual governance and stop interfering with your protocols. Sir. That's an order, General. Protect her while I remember how to be king instead of terrified guard dog. Thorn saluted. Ceres leaned up and kissed him gently. This is the right choice. Then why does it feel like I'm abandoning you? Because your fear tells you control equals protection. But sometimes protection means letting go. The intelligence report landed on Vaelor's desk like a declaration of war. 3 assassination attempts. 3 different noble houses funding them. But the coordination pattern was wrong, too precise, too synchronized. Someone with intimate knowledge of palace security had been feeding information to external conspirators, guard rotation schedules, vulnerable access points, Ceres's daily movements. Someone on the Imperial Council was the architect. Vaelor spread the documents across his war table while dawn light crept through chamber windows. Financial records traced through shell accounts and intermediaries. Communication intercepts showing coded language that matched internal security protocols. A conspiracy that had been operating for months, maybe years, right under his attention. The betrayer was an external enemy. It was someone he trusted enough to include in governance discussions. Someone who sat in council meetings and offered strategic advice while simultaneously orchestrating his destruction. The realization hit like cold water. Trust was the vulnerability Arcturus had warned about. Not just trusting Ceres, but trusting anyone. The moment you built relationships, you created leverage points. The moment you delegated authority, you enabled betrayal. His father had trusted Arcturus Rivarin during grief. That trust had killed him slowly. Vaelor had trusted his council to help govern while he integrated attachment with capability. That trust was being weaponized right now. General Thorn entered without knocking, face carved from granite and urgency. We've identified the leak, he said. Financial forensics traced the intermediary payments back through 7 shell accounts. It terminates at a palace account with access privileges restricted to council-level authority. Who? Lord Caston. The Eastern Territories, Lord. The one who defended Lady Vale during your first council confrontation. The words didn't make sense for 3 full seconds. Caston had been one of the few voices supporting integration of attachment with governance, had argued publicly that Vaelor's capability wasn't compromised, had seemed genuinely invested in proving the new philosophy could work, and the entire time he'd been funding assassination attempts. The elegance of it made Vaelor sick. What better way to ensure attachment looked like fatal weakness than to orchestrate attacks while publicly defending the relationship? Make Vaelor paranoid, force him into defensive posture, then point to the paranoia as proof of compromise. Arcturus's conspiracy hadn't ended with his execution. It had evolved, adapted, found a new face to continue the work. "Where is he now?" Vaelor asked. "Council chambers. Regular morning session starts in an hour. He doesn't know we've identified him yet." Vaelor stood. His hand moved to the blade at his hip, battlefield instinct reasserting itself. "Cancel the session. Seal the palace. No one enters or leaves until this is resolved. Sir, if we move against him without proper procedure, the other council members will..." "Will what? Defend a traitor who's been trying to kill my consort for months? Let them try." Thorn studied him carefully. "This is the test," he said quietly. "Right now. Whether you can handle internal betrayal without letting rage compromise judgment. Caston deserves consequences, but how you deliver them matters. Summary execution looks like exactly the kind of emotional overreaction your enemies want to see." Vaelor felt fury warring with strategy. Every cell screamed to find Caston and end him immediately, personally. Make the death slow enough to communicate the cost of betrayal. But Thorn was right. This moment defined everything. Either he proved capable of measured justice, even when betrayed by trusted advisor, or he confirmed every fear about attachment destroying judgment. The Empire was watching, waiting for him to fail the test. "Fine," Vaelor said. "We do this properly. Convene the full council. Present evidence publicly. Let them see the scope of his betrayal before consequences are delivered. And then I execute him, in front of everyone who thought trusting people was sustainable governance strategy." The Imperial Council assembled within the hour. 24 lords and military commanders filled the chamber, confusion evident on most faces. Emergency sessions weren't announced. The atmosphere felt wrong, tense in ways that suggested violence rather than policy discussion. Vaelor entered last with Ceres beside him and Thorn flanking. He'd worn battlefield armor instead of ceremonial robes. The message was clear. This wasn't political theater. This was reckoning. Lord Caston sat in his usual position, young face showing appropriate concern, but nothing resembling guilt. He was good. Vaelor had to give him that. The performance was flawless. "Thank you for attending on short notice," Vaelor began. His voice carried the cold precision of military briefings. "We've discovered a conspiracy operating within palace walls. Someone on this council has been coordinating assassination attempts against Lady Ceres Vael, funding external operators, providing intelligence on security protocols, orchestrating the very attacks that have been used to argue my attachment compromises effectiveness." The council erupted in overlapping denials and shocked questions. Vaelor let them process for 30 seconds, then raised his hand for silence. "General Thorn will present evidence." Thorn stepped forward with documents, financial records, communication intercepts, timeline correlations between council meetings and subsequent attacks. He laid it out with methodical precision, every piece of evidence building toward inescapable conclusion. The conspiracy traced back to Lord Caston. As Thorn presented, Vaelor watched Caston's face, watched the exact moment realization hit, the discovery was complete. Watched calculation replace concern, watched a conspirator recognizing the game was over. Caston stood slowly. "May I speak in my defense?" "You can try," Vaelor said. The younger lord moved to the center of the chamber. He showed no fear, just that same calculating intelligence that had made him valuable advisor before revelation of betrayal. "The evidence is accurate," Caston admitted. "I've been coordinating attempts on Lady Vael's life for the past 8 months, funding operators, providing security intelligence, everything General Thorn documented." The council stared in shock. "Why?" someone asked. Caston looked directly at Vaelor. "Because you were right the first time. Attachment is fatal weakness. Your father proved it, and you were building an empire on that lesson. one strong enough to survive anything because it was governed by pure strategic capability without emotional compromise. Then you chose her and started unraveling everything you'd built. He gestured to Ceres. I watched you become paranoid, watched governance drift while you obsessed over her protection, watched the Iron King who conquered territories transform into a terrified guard dog. And I realized, if I let this continue, the empire would crumble, not from external threat, but from your attachment making you vulnerable in ways enemies could exploit forever. So you tried to kill her. I tried to prove a point, that attachment compromises capability, that the paranoia and distraction and poor decisions you've made since choosing her validate every lesson you built your reign on. I orchestrated attacks not because I wanted her dead, but because I wanted you to see what she costs. Vaelor's hands gripped the table edge hard enough to make knuckles white. You betrayed me, coordinated with my enemies, tried to murder someone under my protection. And you're framing this as helping me? I'm framing it as saving the Empire from your weakness. Your father loved your mother and nearly destroyed Nerith when grief broke him. You were supposed to be better, the king who learned from that failure. But instead you're repeating it, choosing personal attachment over strategic necessity, letting emotion compromise every decision. His voice gained intensity. The attacks were supposed to force you to choose, to realize the cost of keeping her alive, to see that governing effectively and protecting what you care about are fundamentally incompatible. I gave you every opportunity to correct course, to send her away and return to being the ruler this empire needs. But you didn't. You kept choosing her, kept proving that attachment had destroyed your judgment beyond recovery. Silence filled the chamber. Then Vaelor laughed. It was cold and sharp as winter steel. You want to know the funny part, Caston? You're absolutely right about some of it. Attachment did make me paranoid, did compromise my focus, did force me into defensive positions where I governed less effectively. Everything you predicted happened. He stepped forward. But what you missed, what Arcturus missed, what every enemy of mine has consistently failed to understand, is that capability doesn't evaporate because someone cares about something. It adapts, evolves, finds new expressions. You think I'm weaker now? You think choosing her made me vulnerable in ways that destroy effectiveness? Then explain how I crushed the Southern Rebellion while protecting her simultaneously. Explain how I've identified and eliminated every conspiracy you coordinated. Explain how I'm standing here having discovered your betrayal despite all your advantages of position and trust. Caston's expression flickered. You're not weaker than I was when I governed through pure isolation, Vaelor continued. You're facing something more dangerous. A ruler who's learned to integrate humanity with capability, who can care deeply and still be absolutely brutal toward threats, who's motivated by something beyond abstract legacy. He moved closer. The old philosophy said attachment was weakness that needed eliminating. The new reality is that attachment is vulnerability that sharpens focus. Yes, it makes me care whether she lives or dies, but the caring doesn't paralyze me. It clarifies exactly what I'm protecting and why. It gives me reason to be better at this than I ever was when I governed from fear of becoming my father. You've proven otherwise, Caston argued. The paranoia, the obsessive security reviews, the governance drift. We're learning curve. Adaptation period while I figured out how to balance competing priorities. And yes, I struggled, made mistakes, demonstrated exactly the kind of compromise you wanted to highlight. But struggle isn't failure unless you quit. And I didn't quit. He stopped 3 feet from Caston. You orchestrated attacks to prove attachment was fatal weakness. Instead, you've proven I can identify betrayal among trusted advisors, adapt security protocols, and govern effectively despite constant threat. That's the opposite of your thesis. That's demonstration that attachment and capability can coexist if you're strategic enough. Caston shook his head. You're rationalizing, trying to frame obvious vulnerability as strength. But every noble in this room sees the truth, sees that you've been compromised in ways that invite exploitation. And no amount of clever rhetoric changes that basic reality. Then let's test it, Vaelor said. Right now. You've been coordinating with external houses, yes? Funding assassination attempts through intermediaries? So presumably you have allies, support, people who share your assessment that I'm compromised beyond recovery. He looked around the chamber. Anyone here agree with Lord Caston? Anyone think attachment has destroyed my capability to rule? Anyone want to defend his actions as necessary intervention? Silence. Not one voice spoke in Caston's defense. Because whatever they thought privately about attachment compromising judgment, betrayal was still betrayal. Coordinating assassination attempts against the king's consort while sitting on his council crossed lines that political disagreement didn't justify. Caston stood alone in the center of the chamber with no allies willing to identify themselves. Vaelor continued, his voice dropping to something soft and lethal. You were supposed to be the new version of Arcturus, young, idealistic, publicly supportive, while privately orchestrating destruction. But you made critical mistakes. First, you underestimated my capability to adapt. Second, you overestimated how much the Empire feared my attachment. And third, most fatal, you targeted her. He paused. You could have come at me directly, challenged my authority publicly, organized political opposition, built coalition against my governance philosophy. Any of that would have been legitimate resistance. But you went for her, tried to kill the one person who reminds me I'm human underneath the crown. That wasn't strategic calculation. That was terror. Your terror that if I succeeded in integrating attachment with capability, it would invalidate everything you believed about strength requiring isolation. So you tried to destroy the evidence before I could prove you wrong. Well, here's the proof. I'm still standing. She's still alive. Your conspiracy's exposed, and the Empire hasn't crumbled. If anything, it's more stable now than when I governed through pure isolation. Because instead of one paranoid ruler trying to control everything alone, I've built infrastructure that functions even when I'm compromised by personal investment. Caston's face had gone pale. What now? He asked quietly. Summary execution like Arcturus? No, Vaelor said. Something worse. You're going to stand trial. Public presentation of your conspiracy before the entire Empire. Every house that you coordinated with, every assassination you funded, every piece of intelligence you leaked, all of it exposed. Then you're going to be executed not as martyr to some ideological point about attachment, but as traitor who betrayed his king out of fear of being proven wrong. Caston lunged then, fast and desperate. His hand went for a hidden blade, backup plan for if discovery came. He made it 3 feet before Vaelor's blade took him through the chest. The young lord dropped to marble floors, blood spreading in dark pool. His eyes were wide with shock. Surprised that the king he'd considered compromised could still move with battlefield efficiency. Vaelor knelt beside him. You want to know the real difference between me and my father? He said quietly. My father was alone when Arcturus manipulated him, isolated by the same philosophy you tried to defend. I'm not alone. I have her, yes, but I also have commanders, advisors, infrastructure of support that functions even when I'm compromised. That's the lesson. Not that attachment is weakness, but that isolation is fatal and connection is survival strategy. Caston tried to speak. Blood bubbled from his lips. Tell whoever you see next, Vaelor continued, that orchestrating destruction of what rulers care about doesn't make you strategic. It makes you evil. And evil gets killed regardless of how well-intentioned it thinks it is. The young lord died staring at ceiling frescoes showing past kings in moments of glory. Vaelor stood slowly, turned to face the council. Blood dripped from his blade onto floors that had witnessed generations of imperial business. The room was silent except for breathing and the wet sound of dying. Anyone else? He asked. His voice was steady as stone. Anyone else think my attachment compromises effectiveness? Anyone want to test whether I can govern and protect simultaneously? No one spoke, because they just watched their king discover internal betrayal, expose a conspiracy, and kill the traitor with battlefield efficiency, all while the woman he'd supposedly been compromised by stood 3 feet away, watching with clear eyes. If that was compromise, it looked an awful lot like capability. Vaelor sheathed his blade. Lord Caston coordinated with houses Malthus, Corvin, and Thrace. All 3 have been funding external operators to target Lady Vale. General Thorn, you'll mobilize forces to those territories, seize assets, arrest house leadership, bring them to Moonspire for trial. Thorn saluted. The rest of you. This is what happens when you confuse philosophical disagreement with permission to orchestrate murder. You don't get debate. You don't get political resistance. You get investigated, exposed, and eliminated. Questions? Silence. Good. This council is dismissed. We'll reconvene in 3 days after I've had time to vet everyone in this room for additional conspirators. If you're clean, you continue serving. If you're not, you join Caston on marble floors. They left quickly. Nobles filing out with pale faces and backward glances at the body bleeding out in their chamber. When the room cleared, only Vaelor, Ceres, and Thorn remained. That was brutal, Ceres said quietly. That was necessary, Vaelor corrected. Every house in the Empire needed to see what happens when you target what I care about. No more subtle orchestration, no more layered conspiracies, just immediate violent consequence. He looked at the body. Caston thought I'd be paralyzed by discovering betrayal among trusted advisors. Thought it would confirm that trusting anyone was strategic error. But the opposite is true. Discovering betrayal just clarifies who's actually loyal and who's exploiting access. You killed him before trial, Thorn observed. That's the emotional overreaction they've been accusing you of. He was drawing a weapon. That's self-defense during apprehension of traitor. Any noble with legal training will recognize the distinction. Will they, though? Or will they see a king so compromised by attachment that he kills people who threaten it? Let them see whatever they want. I'm done calibrating every action to counter their narrative. Caston orchestrated assassination attempts for months. He deserved death. I delivered it. That's the beginning and end of the calculation. Thorn studied him carefully. You've changed, he said. Not just since you chose Lady Vale. Since you discovered Arcturus's conspiracy. Something fundamental shifted. Vaelor considered that. I stopped being afraid, he said finally. For 20 years I governed from fear of becoming my father. Fear that attachment would break me. Fear that caring about anyone would create vulnerability I couldn't defend against. That fear shaped every decision, made me isolated, paranoid, incapable of genuine trust. He looked at Ceres. Then I chose her and the fear manifested. Everything I'd worried about happened. Conspiracies targeting her, assassination attempts, political instability, my own paranoia compromising effectiveness. All of it came true, and I survived it. We survived it. Which means the fear was lying. Attachment didn't destroy me. It just forced me to develop new capabilities. So now, Ceres asked, now I govern without fear. Yes, people will target you to get to me. Yes, that creates vulnerability. But vulnerability isn't weakness if you're strategic about managing it. I have infrastructure, advisors, military capability. I don't need to be perfect and isolated. I just need to be effective enough and connected enough to survive challenges. That's the real lesson my father never learned. He thought he had to be invulnerable. When vulnerability found him anyway through my mother's death, it shattered him. But vulnerability is inevitable. The question is whether you've built structures strong enough to survive when it hits. And have you? Built structures strong enough? We're about to find out. Because eliminating Caston had been necessary but insufficient. 3 noble houses remained, Malthus, Corvin, Thrace, that had coordinated with the conspiracy. They'd bet on Vaelor being too compromised to respond effectively. Now they faced military action and complete asset seizure. The Empire was about to witness whether their king could prosecute multi-front conflict while maintaining capital stability and protecting what he cared about. It was the final test Arcturus had designed, the ultimate demonstration of whether attachment and capability could coexist. The campaign against the conspirator houses took 2 weeks. General Thorn led forces against House Malthus in the Western Territories. Commander Yara handled House Corvin's strongholds, and Vaelor personally led the assault on House Thrace, the most fortified and dangerous of the 3. Ceres remained in Moonspire under maximum security. They discussed her coming with him. She'd argued for it. But this time, Vaelor had been firm. This is combat deployment, not political demonstration. I need focus. And I need to know you're secured behind defenses I trust while I'm in field. She'd accepted it. Understood that strategic partnership sometimes meant separation when missions required it. But the fear was still there, on both sides. Fear that this would be the moment conspiracy succeeded. That he'd return to find her dead. That she'd receive word he'd fallen in battle. Fear was inevitable now. The question was whether they functioned despite it. House Thrace's fortress sat on a cliff overlooking the northern sea. Defensible position with limited approach vectors. Lord Thrace had spent 2 decades building military capability that rivaled smaller kingdoms. He'd also been funding assassination attempts for 8 months, coordinating with Castin, betting that Vaelor would be too compromised to respond effectively. That bet was about to cost him everything. Vaelor's forces surrounded the fortress at dawn, 5,000 troops against Thrace's 3,000 defenders. Superior numbers, but the terrain advantage partially offset that. Lord Thrace appeared on the fortress walls, old warrior with gray beard and hard eyes. "King Vaelor," he called down, "I request parley before hostilities begin." Vaelor rode forward alone. "What terms could you possibly offer that don't end with your execution?" Thrace smiled grimly. "None that I expect you to accept, but I wanted to speak before this ends, to explain why some of us believe attachment compromises you beyond recovery. You coordinated assassination attempts. There's nothing to explain beyond treason. It's not treason to try to save the Empire from its ruler's weakness. Your father taught us what happens when kings love too deeply. Arcturus was right to eliminate that vulnerability, and Castin was right to try again when you repeated the mistake." Vaelor's hand rested on his blade. "So your position is that murdering queens and targeting consorts is justified intervention? My position is that rulers who let personal feeling govern them endanger everyone who depends on their strength. Yes, you've survived so far, but survival isn't sustainability. Eventually your attachment will force an impossible choice, and when it does, people will die because you couldn't make the hard decision. Then I'll carry that cost," Vaelor said. "But I'm done letting people like you dictate philosophy through orchestrated tragedy. Arcturus killed my mother to prove a point. Castin tried to kill Ceres for the same reason. You funded it all thinking you were saving the Empire. But what you actually did was demonstrate that the only fatal weakness in governance is letting fear of vulnerability prevent genuine connection. My father was destroyed not by loving my mother, but by having no support structure when she died. I've built that structure. It's imperfect, but it's there. And it means I can survive challenges he couldn't." Thrace shook his head. "Pretty philosophy. But philosophy doesn't hold when steel comes for what you care about. We'll see how long your conviction lasts when she's actually threatened. She's been threatened constantly for months. I'm still standing. She's still alive. Your conspirators are dead or captured. Where's the collapse you predicted?" "It's coming," Thrace said quietly, "because we're not done. There are others who share our assessment, who understand that your attachment is Empire's greatest vulnerability, and they're more patient than Arcturus, more subtle than Castin. Eventually, they'll find the right moment, the right threat, and you'll break exactly like your father did. Then I'll deal with them when they reveal themselves, same as I've dealt with you." He wheeled his horse back toward his lines. "Last chance, Lord Thrace. Surrender now and face trial, or die defending treason." "We all die eventually, Your Majesty. At least we'll die believing we tried to save something worth protecting." The battle lasted 6 hours. House Thrace fought with desperate capability. They knew surrender meant execution, so they sold their lives expensively, forced Vaelor's troops to pay for every foot of fortress, every corridor, every defensive position. But superior numbers and strategic brilliance overwhelmed determination. By sunset, the fortress had fallen. Lord Thrace died on his walls with blade in hand. His house was eliminated down to minor branch families who'd had no involvement in conspiracy. Vaelor stood in the wreckage feeling exhaustion that went deeper than physical. 3 houses destroyed, dozens dead. An empire stabilized through overwhelming demonstration of consequences. But at costs that kept accumulating, lives spent, relationships shattered, trust becoming ever more rare and precious commodity. This was governance now. Not clean strategy and political maneuvering, but constant warfare against people who saw his humanity as exploitable weakness. Thorn found him among the ruins. "We've secured the fortress. Minimal casualties on our side. House Thrace is eliminated as political entity." "Good. Any intelligence on additional conspirators?" "Nothing concrete, but Thrace's final words suggest others are waiting. More patient, more careful." "Of course they are, because targeting her has proven to be an effective pressure point even if individual attempts fail. They'll keep trying until someone succeeds or I kill them all." "Can you kill them all?" Vaelor looked at his general. "I have to try, because the alternative is living in permanent fear that the next conspiracy will be the one that succeeds. That's not sustainable. So I eliminate threats as they reveal themselves and build defenses strong enough to survive the ones I don't see coming. That's not victory, Thorn said. That's survival. There's a difference. Right now, survival is victory enough. They rode back toward Moonspire carrying word of triumph that felt hollow. House Thrace destroyed. Conspirator network disrupted. Empire stabilized through brutal demonstration of consequences. But Thrace's final warning echoed in Vaelor's mind. There are others. More patient. More subtle. The conspiracy wasn't over. It had just evolved again. And somewhere in the Empire, someone was watching his victories and learning from his enemy's failures. Calculating exactly how to exploit attachment as leverage. Waiting for the perfect moment. The moment when vulnerability would finally shatter capability. 5 days later, Vaelor reached Moonspire. The palace stood unchanged, marble and menace and the ordinary machinery of Empire grinding forward. But something felt wrong. Tension in the air. Guards positioned differently than protocol specified. Thorn felt it too. "Sir, something's happened." They rode through gates at speed, found Commander Yara waiting in the courtyard with expression that made Vaelor's blood freeze. "What is it?" he demanded. "Lady Vael, Your Majesty. She's gone." The words didn't process immediately. "Gone where?" "Taken. 3 nights ago. Professional team, 20 operators. They hit during guard rotation, killed 8 defenders, and extracted her from secured chambers. We've been trying to track them since, but the trail goes cold at the northern border." Vaelor felt something crack inside his chest. The fear he'd been managing, the vulnerability he'd been strategic about, the attachment he'd integrated into governance, all of it crystallized into pure terror. She was gone, taken by enemies who understood exactly how to break him. And standing there in Moonspire's courtyard with victory over House Thrace meaningless in his hands, Vaelor realized the conspiracy had never been about killing her. It had been about taking her hostage, about forcing the impossible choice his father had never faced. Empire or the woman he loved, strategy or attachment. Everything Arcturus had orchestrated, everything Caston had coordinated, everything Thrace had died defending. It had all been preparation for this moment, the moment when Vaelor would have to choose what mattered more. And somewhere beyond the northern border, someone was waiting with Ceres as hostage and an ultimatum that would define the rest of his reign. The frost waste stretched before him like the edge of the world. Vaelor rode alone through landscapes so barren it felt like punishment made geography. No trees, no shelter, just endless white broken by jagged ice formations that looked like teeth waiting to bite. Wind screamed across frozen earth, carrying cold that went beyond temperature into something that felt personal. Behind him, 3 days back, General Thorn and 500 cavalry waited at the border. Vaelor had ordered them to hold position. If he didn't return by dawn tomorrow, they were to retreat to Moonspire and begin succession protocols. Because this wasn't a rescue mission that military force could solve. This was the final test Arcturus had designed across 2 generations. The moment where attachment and empire went to war inside him, and only one survived. The coordinates led to ruins of some ancient fortress from before Nareth existed, crumbling stone walls barely visible against snow, defensive positions that had defended nothing for centuries. And in the center, a figure waited. Not Ceres. Not yet. A woman stood alone in the ruins. Older, maybe 50, with silver hair and eyes that held calculations spanning decades. She wore no house colors, no identifying marks, just dark travel clothes and an expression that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment her entire life. "King Vaelor," she greeted. "Thank you for coming alone." "Where is she?" "Safe. For now. Whether she stays that way depends entirely on what happens in the next hour." Vaelor dismounted. His hand rested on his blade but didn't draw. "Not yet." "Who are you?" "My name is Alyssa Kyle. Dr. Malthus Kale was my father. The physician who poisoned your mother 26 years ago under Lord Arcturus's orders." The revelation hit like a blade between ribs. "Your father murdered my mother." "He did," Alyssa agreed calmly. "And he was executed for it when your father finally discovered the truth 2 years before he died. Hanged in secret to avoid political upheaval. House Reverin paid well to keep that quiet. But my father died knowing he'd succeeded in his mission, breaking a king who loved too deeply." Vaelor felt rage and confusion warring for dominance. "So what is this? Revenge? You've taken Ceres to make me suffer the way your father made my father suffer? Alyssa shook her head. This isn't revenge. This is conclusion. My father spent his life studying a simple question, whether rulers who allow attachment to influence their decisions can govern effectively, or whether personal feeling inevitably compromises capability. He believed the latter, proved it by destroying your father through eliminating what he loved. She moved closer. But you've complicated the thesis. You've survived months of conspiracies designed to prove attachment was fatal weakness. You've adapted, built structures, demonstrated that maybe, just maybe, caring about someone doesn't have to destroy effectiveness. That's fascinating. It's also terrifying to people who've built their entire worldview on isolation as necessary survival mechanism. So you've taken her to test whether I'll collapse like my father did. I've taken her to give you a choice. The same choice every ruler throughout history has faced when personal feeling conflicts with strategic necessity. Empire or love? Stability or attachment? The rational calculation that one life isn't worth risking everything versus the irrational certainty that some things matter more than empires. Where is she? Alyssa gestured toward the ruins. Inside, chained but unharmed, guarded by 20 professional soldiers who will kill her the moment they see hostile action. You can't fight your way to her, can't negotiate, can't use military capability or strategic brilliance. The only variable that determines her survival is what you choose. And the choice is abdicate. Publicly announce you're stepping down as King of Nereth in favor of a Regency Council. Admit that attachment has compromised your capability beyond recovery. Let the Empire be governed by people who understand isolation as necessary strength. Do that, and she lives. You both live. You can disappear together, build whatever life you want away from governance. Vaelor stared at her. You want me to destroy everything I've built, abandon the Empire, prove that attachment was fatal weakness all along. I want you to prove what actually matters more, your crown or her life, strategy or love, everything Arcturus orchestrated, everything my father died trying to demonstrate, everything the past year has been building toward. It culminates here, in this choice. And if I refuse, if I call your bluff and dare you to kill her, then she dies. And you return to Moonspire alone to govern an empire that will forever know you chose crown over the woman you claim to love completely. That you were willing to sacrifice her to maintain power. Every speech you've given about integrating attachment with capability becomes exposed as performance. And you spend the rest of your reign as exactly what you swore never to become. An isolated ruler governing through pure dominance because the alternative cost too much. The wind screamed through ruins carrying ice crystals that stung exposed skin. Vaelor felt the full weight of the choice crushing down. This was the trap his father had never faced. Aldrich had lost his queen to illness before choosing was necessary. The grief had destroyed him, yes, but at least he'd never been forced to decide between her and Empire. Vaelor had to make that choice now, with full awareness of consequences. Abdicate and she lives, but the Empire falls into Regency chaos. All his work dismantled, philosophy invalidated, attachment proven as fatal weakness that destroyed the most capable ruler Nereth had ever known. Refuse and she dies. But he maintains power, continues governing, proves capability wasn't compromised. At cost of living with knowledge, he'd let her die rather than surrender crown. There was no third option, no clever strategy, no military solution, just brutal mathematics of what mattered more. How long do I have to decide, he asked. Until sunset, 3 hours. After that, my people have orders to execute her and disappear. You'll never find the body, never have closure, just permanent uncertainty about whether she suffered, whether she died believing you'd abandoned her. Alyssa turned to leave. I'll be here when you're ready to announce your decision. Choose well, Your Majesty. This is the moment that defines everything. She disappeared into ruins, leaving Vaelor alone with wind and ice, an impossible choice. He stood there processing options that all led to devastation. Every strategic instinct said refusing was correct calculation. One life against an empire. Personal feeling against thousands of lives that depended on stable governance. His father had been destroyed by grief over losing his queen. What would happen if Vaelor deliberately sacrificed an entire empire for one person? But strategy wasn't the only voice in his head anymore. For 20 years, he had built philosophy on the principle that attachment was weakness to be eliminated, that rulers who let personal feeling influence decisions endangered everyone. He'd governed with perfect isolation and absolute control. Then Ceres had entered his life accidentally, and everything had changed. She'd made him remember he was human underneath the crown, made him believe that caring about someone could coexist with capability, that vulnerability wasn't fatal if you were strategic about protecting it. But now vulnerability had crystallized into this moment. All the paranoia Arcturus had predicted, all the impossible choices Caston had warned about, all of it converging into one brutal test. Could he actually sacrifice her to maintain power? Could he live with himself if he did? The questions had no good answers, just consequences that would define the rest of his existence regardless of choice. Vaelor walked into the ruins. He found her in what used to be a great hall, stone walls open to sky, floor covered in snow. She was chained to a support pillar, surrounded by guards who watched with professional wariness. Ceres looked up when he entered. Her face showed exhaustion and fear, but no surprise. She'd known he would come. Question was what he'd do when he got here. The guards tensed but didn't attack. They had orders. Wait for his choice. Vaelor moved close enough to speak without the guards hearing clearly. Are you hurt? Her voice was hoarse but steady. I'm fine. Scared, but fine. They haven't touched me beyond restraints. He wanted to touch her, pull her close and feel her breathing, but guards surrounded them with blades ready. Alyssa gave me a choice, he said quietly. Abdicate or you die. Empire or you. Everything we've been fighting to prove, that attachment and capability can coexist, tested in one impossible decision. Ceres met his eyes. You can't abdicate. You know that. The Empire would collapse into Regency chaos. Everything you've built would be dismantled. All the philosophy about integrating humanity with governance would be invalidated as weakness that destroyed you. So I let you die? You do what rulers do. You survive loss and continue governing, like you said your father should have done. Like you've been training yourself to do for 20 years. Her words were calm, but tears ran down her face. I don't want to die, Vaelor. I'm terrified. But I understand the mathematics. One life against an empire. Personal feeling against strategic necessity. It's the calculation you were built to make. I don't want to make it, but you have to. That's what this is. The final proof that you're not your father, that you can face loss without crumbling. That attachment didn't destroy your capability, it just forced you to develop new ones, including the capability to survive losing what you care about. She was giving him permission, telling him to choose empire, to prove attachment hadn't compromised him beyond recovery. But standing there looking at the woman who'd made him human again, Vaelor realized something that terrified him more than any battlefield ever had. He didn't care about the proof anymore. Didn't care about validating philosophy or demonstrating capability or proving his enemies wrong. All of that was abstract strategy, intellectual exercise in governance theory. She was real, her breathing, her tears, her presence in his life. That was concrete, valuable in ways empire had never been. And for the first time in his life, Vaelor understood what his father had felt. Why grief had broken him. Why love had mattered more than strategic necessity. Because some things were worth any cost, even empire. He stepped back from her, turned to face the guards. Tell Alyssa I've made my decision. They brought her back to the ruin's center. Vaelor stood waiting with wind howling around him. Well? Alyssa asked. I abdicate. Effective immediately, I renounce claim to Nereth's throne. A regency council will govern until stable succession is established. You release Ceres unharmed. We leave together and never return to imperial politics. The words felt like tearing out his own spine. Everything he'd built, everything he'd fought for. 2 decades of philosophy and governance dismantled in single sentence. But Ceres would live. That mattered more. Alyssa studied him with an expression he couldn't read. You're willing to surrender everything for her. Prove that attachment was fatal weakness all along. Validate every accusation your enemies made. Become exactly what you swore never to be. A ruler destroyed by loving someone. Yes. Why? Because the alternative is worse. I can survive losing empire. I can't survive losing her. That's not strategic calculation. That's just truth. And I'm done pretending otherwise. Alyssa was silent for a long moment. Then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Your father failed this test, she said quietly. When Arcturus killed your mother, Aldrich had no choice to make. She was just gone. His grief destroyed him because he never had opportunity to prove what mattered more. But you've had that opportunity. And you chose her. She gestured to the guards. Release Lady Vael. They moved immediately, unlocked her chains, helped her stand on unsteady legs. Cerys stumbled toward Vaelor. He caught her, held her close enough to feel heartbeat and breathing and the reality of her alive. What's happening? Cerys whispered. I don't know. Alyssa approached them. This was never about forcing abdication, she said. It was about answering my father's question, whether attachment compromises capability or whether it reveals what capability is actually for. You've spent months proving you can govern while caring about someone. But the final test was whether you'd sacrifice what you cared about to maintain power. You just proved you wouldn't. So this was a test? Vaelor's voice was raw. Everything since Arcturus died has been a test. Multiple conspirators, coordinated attacks, all designed to create progressively impossible situations. To see if attachment would eventually compromise you beyond recovery. And it did, just not the way we predicted. She looked at them both. You were compromised the moment you admitted you'd choose her over empire. That's definitional failure of rulership according to traditional philosophy. A king who would surrender crown to save one life has proven attachment destroyed judgment. But here's what my father never understood, what Arcturus never grasped, what I've learned watching you these past months. Capability isn't about dominating without feeling. It's about knowing what you're protecting and why. You built an empire through isolation, yes, but that empire was means to an end you'd never articulated, surviving long enough to find something worth surviving for. She was that something. And proving you'd sacrifice everything for her doesn't invalidate capability. It clarifies purpose. Vaelor processed her words slowly. So I don't have to abdicate? Oh, you should absolutely abdicate, Alyssa said. Not because attachment compromised you, but because you've proven the question itself was wrong. Traditional philosophy says rulers need isolation to maintain effectiveness. You've demonstrated that's half-truth at best. Rulers need clarity about what they're protecting. Whether that's abstract empire or concrete person doesn't determine capability, just motivation. She started walking away. The choice is yours, King Vaelor. Return to Moonspire and govern with the knowledge you'd have surrendered it all to save her. Or actually surrender it and build something different. Either way, you've answered the question. Attachment didn't destroy you. It revealed who you are underneath the crown. Wait, Vaelor called. Why did you do this? Really? Alyssa looked back. My father died believing isolation was strength. That attachment was fatal weakness that destroyed rulers. I wanted to know if he was right. If killing your mother to break your father was justified by the philosophy it proved. Or if maybe the entire thesis was wrong from the beginning. You've given me an answer. Attachment is vulnerability, yes. But vulnerability isn't weakness if you're brave enough to protect what you care about while still functioning. That's harder than isolation. Requires more capability, not less. My father was wrong, and I needed to know that before I died. She disappeared into ruins. The guards followed her. Within minutes, Vaelor and Cerys stood alone in frozen wasteland with wind screaming and sunset approaching. What do we do now? Cerys asked. Vaelor held her close while processing everything. Alyssa was right about one thing. Returning to Moonspire meant governing with the knowledge he'd been willing to surrender crown. Every decision from now forward would be filtered through that revelation. He'd proven attachment could compromise him when stakes were high enough. But was that actually compromise, or was it clarity? For 20 years, he'd believed empire was the purpose. That governance was end in itself. Build power, expand territory, maintain control. Those were the goals that mattered. But standing in ruins holding the woman he'd been willing to trade everything for, Vaelor understood those had never been purposes. Just mechanisms. Ways to survive long enough to find actual meaning. She was the meaning. The purpose underneath all the strategy. Which meant the empire had only ever been valuable as structure to protect what mattered. And if it couldn't do that, if maintaining crown required sacrificing her, then empire had failed its fundamental purpose. We go back, he said finally. But different. Not as king desperate to prove attachment doesn't compromise capability. As ruler who understands what capability is actually for. Who governs because the empire protects people like you? Who uses power as tool rather than treating it as purpose? And if they challenge you, say you're compromised beyond recovery, then I'll demonstrate otherwise, same as I've been doing, but without fear that they're right, without terror that vulnerability will destroy me, just capability deployed in service of something worth protecting. Saris pulled back enough to look at his face. You've changed, not just since we met, since this moment, since choosing me over empire, because I finally understand what my father felt, why he crumbled when she died. It wasn't weakness, it was recognizing that everything else was empty without her. Empire, power, legacy, all of it was just noise compared to the woman who made him feel human. I spent 20 years trying not to become him, trying to be stronger, more isolated, immune to the vulnerability that destroyed him. But strength isn't immunity, it's surviving vulnerability without letting it paralyze you. Can you do that? Survive knowing you're vulnerable? I have to. Because the alternative is becoming what I was before. Capable, but hollow. Effective, but empty. I'd rather be vulnerable and human than invulnerable and dead inside. They rode back toward Nareth's border through sunset that painted frozen landscape in shades of blood and gold. 3 days later, they reached Moonspire. The palace looked unchanged, but felt different. Word had spread about his choice, about being willing to abdicate rather than let her die. The Empire was processing what that meant. General Thorn met them in the courtyard with expression that mixed relief and concern. Your Majesty, Lady Vael, thank every power you're both alive. Alyssa Kyle released us, Vaelor said. The conspiracy is over. For now. For now. There will always be people who believe attachment is weakness, who think targeting what I care about gives them leverage. But the test is passed. I've proven I can choose her and still govern, or I've proven choosing her matters more than governing. Honestly, I'm not sure which. But either way, I'm done letting fear of that question dictate philosophy. Thorn studied him. The council is waiting. They've heard rumors about abdication. They need to know if their king is staying or leaving. Tell them we'll convene tomorrow. I need time to rest and figure out what governance looks like now. That night, alone in his chambers with Saris beside him, Vaelor finally let exhaustion win. He'd spent months fighting conspiracies, weeks proving capability wasn't compromised, days facing impossible choice. All of it had led here, to understanding that the question itself had been trap. Traditional philosophy said attachment was weakness because it created vulnerability enemies could exploit. But that framed governance as pure defense, constant battle to eliminate pressure points and maintain invulnerability. The new philosophy, the one he was still figuring out, recognized vulnerability as inevitable. The question wasn't how to avoid it, but what you built around it. Infrastructure strong enough to function when you were compromised. People trustworthy enough to carry weight when you couldn't. Systems resilient enough to survive when personal feeling pulled you away from perfect strategy. That was harder than isolation, required more capability, not less. But it was also more sustainable, more human, more worth protecting. You're thinking too hard, Ceres said quietly. I can feel it from here. Just processing. Everything that happened, everything we survived, everything that's coming, what is coming, governance. But different. Not king trying to prove attachment doesn't compromise him. Just ruler who understands what he's protecting and why. Who uses empire as tool to shield what matters rather than treating crown as purpose in itself. She moved closer. That's a better philosophy than the one you started with. Maybe. We'll see if it survives contact with reality. Because people will test it. Challenge whether I can actually govern this way. Whether vulnerability destroys effectiveness or sharpens it. And if it destroys you, then at least I'll fall having tried to be something more than perfect machine. That's worth the risk. They lay in darkness while the palace settled around them. The empire breathing, waiting to see what kind of king emerged from ruins of old philosophy. The next morning, Vaelor convened the Imperial Council. Every lord attended, every commander. The chamber filled with people who'd spent months watching their king navigate impossible situations. who'd debated whether attachment compromised capability, who'd conspired or defended or calculated based on assumptions about weakness and strength. Vaelor entered wearing simple armor instead of ceremonial regalia. He'd left his crown in chambers. This wasn't performance. This was reckoning. He stood before them without preamble. By now you've heard I was willing to abdicate, to surrender crown in exchange for Lady Vael's life, that I chose her over empire when forced to decide. You've probably debated what that means, whether it proves attachment compromised my judgment beyond recovery, whether I'm still capable of effective governance. The chamber was silent. Here's my answer. Yes, I chose her, without hesitation, and I'd make the same choice again. Does that mean attachment has compromised my capability? Depends on how you define capability. If capability means governing without emotional investment, making pure strategic calculations regardless of personal feeling, then yes, I'm compromised. I can no longer do that. Can't pretend people are chess pieces or provinces are numbers on maps. She's made me care, and caring influences decisions. He paused. But if capability means building systems stable enough to survive when rulers are human, creating infrastructure that functions even when personal feeling pulls focus, then I'm more capable now than I was governing through isolation, because I've proven I can adapt, can build around vulnerability instead of being paralyzed by it, can integrate humanity with governance rather than treating them as mutually exclusive. Lord Marcellus spoke up. Your Majesty, with respect, choosing to abdicate, even if you ultimately didn't, reveals catastrophic weakness. A king who would surrender power to save one life has proven himself unfit to hold that power. Or I've proven I understand what power is for, Vaelor countered. For 20 years I treated empire as purpose. Built territories, crushed rebellions, expanded dominance, all valuable. But valuable as means to what end? Just more power? More control? Where does that lead except endless accumulation of something that has no inherent value? She gave me answer. Empire's valuable is structure to protect what matters. People, connection, the possibility of building something worth surviving for. Power is tool. Crown is responsibility. And both are worthless if maintaining them requires sacrificing their purpose. So yes, I was willing to abdicate. Because ruling an empire where I have to choose between power and purpose isn't sustainable. Better to surrender crown than become the kind of ruler who treats people as expendable in service of maintaining authority. But you didn't surrender, another lord pointed out. You made the choice and then were released anyway. How do we know you would have actually followed through? You don't. That's the nature of hypotheticals. But I know. And that knowledge changes everything. I can't govern the way I did before. Can't pretend attachment doesn't influence decisions. Can't return to philosophy built on isolation and domination. He looked around the chamber. So here's what happens next. I remain king, but governance shifts. Instead of ruling through fear and control, we build infrastructure that acknowledges rulers are human. Systems that function when I'm compromised by personal investment. Checks that prevent my attachment from endangering empire without requiring me to be an invulnerable machine. That's harder work. Requires more trust, more delegation, more acceptance that perfection is impossible. But it's also more sustainable, more human, more worth protecting. Anyone who can't accept that philosophy can leave with honor and assets intact. I won't force obedience through fear anymore, just clarity about what kind of empire we're building. The council processed his words in silence. Then General Thorne stood. I've served under you for 20 years, he said. Watched you conquer territories through pure strategic brilliance. Seen you expand this empire into dominant force through capability I've never witnessed matched. And I can tell you with certainty, you're a better king now than you were then. Not because you're more capable in traditional sense, but because you finally understand what you're fighting for. Before, you governed from fear of becoming your father. Now you govern from clarity about what matters. That makes you more dangerous, not less. More focused, not compromised. I'll follow this version of you into whatever comes next. Other commanders nodded agreement. Not universal, some lords still looked uncertain, but enough to indicate the empire wouldn't fracture over philosophical shift. Marcellus spoke again. If we accept this new philosophy, what prevents you from making poor decisions based on personal feeling? What checks exist against attachment compromising strategic necessity? You, Vaelor said simply. This council, military advisors, infrastructure I've built. Part of accepting vulnerability means trusting others to carry weight when I'm compromised, means building systems that survive my humanity instead of requiring my perfection. That's the real lesson. Not that attachment doesn't compromise, it does. But that compromise is manageable if you're strategic about building around it. And Lady Vael, her role in this new governance structure, my consort. Eventually, my queen, if she accepts. But more importantly, the person who reminds me why empire matters, who keeps me human when power would strip that away, who represents the purpose underneath all the strategy. The council debated for hours. Some accepted immediately, others needed convincing, but by sunset new consensus had emerged. King Vaelor would continue ruling. But philosophy had shifted from isolation toward integration, from perfection toward humanity, from domination toward purpose. It was imperfect, experimental, vulnerable to all the challenges traditional philosophy warned against, but it was also real, sustainable, worth protecting. 3 months later, spring arrived in Nerith. The empire had stabilized under new philosophy. Some nobles had left, unwilling to serve under ruler who admitted to vulnerability. But most remained, adapting to governance that acknowledged human limitation while building infrastructure to manage it. Vaelor stood in the frost gardens where moon orchids bloomed under spring sun. Cerys stood beside him wearing crown he'd commissioned, not heavy imperial gold, but delicate silver worked with healing symbols. She'd accepted his proposal 2 weeks ago. The wedding was planned for summer. The empire would witness their king formally choosing attachment over isolation, proving that love and governance could coexist. But standing there in gardens where this had all begun, Vaelor wasn't thinking about weddings or empire, just the woman beside him and the impossible journey they'd survived. "Do you regret it?" she asked quietly. "Choosing me over everything else?" "Every day," he admitted, "because the cost was real. People died. Houses fell. Philosophy I'd built entire reign on got dismantled, all because I couldn't govern the way kings are supposed to, with perfect isolation and strategic necessity ruling every decision. But I don't regret choosing you. Regret the cost, yes. Wish I'd been capable of protecting you without empire having to adapt around my vulnerability. But the choice itself? Never. Because the alternative was worse. Was continuing to govern as perfect machine until something broke me anyway. You broke me in the best way. Forced me to be human. To understand that strength isn't invulnerability, it's surviving vulnerability without losing yourself." She leaned against him. "Your father would be proud. My father would be terrified I'm repeating his mistakes. Maybe. Or maybe he'd recognize you succeeded where he failed. You survived loss, or the threat of it, without crumbling. Built structures strong enough to carry you when attachment pulled focus. Did the work he never got chance to do." Vaelor considered that. Perhaps. But I only managed it because I had warning, infrastructure, people willing to help carry weight. He had none of that. Just grief and isolation and enemies who exploited both. So build different empire, one where future rulers don't face same isolation, where attachment is acknowledged as reality rather than denied as weakness. That's the legacy. Not perfect governance, but sustainable humanity. They stood in gardens while spring sunlight warmed frozen earth. The empire around them functioning, imperfect but alive, human but capable. And Vaelor Draven, once the Iron King who'd conquered through pure domination, learned the final lesson his reign had been building toward. Strength wasn't eliminating vulnerability. It was surviving it, adapting to it, building around it instead of being destroyed by it. His father had failed that test because circumstances gave him no choice. No time to adapt, no infrastructure to lean on, just immediate grief and exploitation. Vaelor had survived because Cerys forced him to build differently, to trust people, to accept help, to integrate attachment with capability instead of treating them as mutually exclusive. That was harder than isolation, required more courage, more faith in systems and people, more acceptance of imperfection. But it was also more human, more sustainable, more worth protecting. And as he stood in gardens holding the woman who'd made him remember, he was more than weapon. Someone pointed at problems, Vaelor understood the truth his entire reign had been searching for. The cost of empire wasn't love. It had never been love. The cost was the years he'd spent believing they were incompatible. The time wasted governing from fear instead of purpose. The isolation that had felt like strength, but was just another prison. She'd freed him from that. Not by eliminating vulnerability, but by teaching him vulnerability was survivable. That being human and being effective weren't contradictory. That attachment could sharpen capability rather than destroying it. The Empire would test that philosophy. Already was testing it. There would be challenges, conspiracies, people who exploited his attachment as leverage. But he'd survived the worst of it, proven he could adapt, could build systems strong enough to function when he was compromised, could be human and king simultaneously if he was strategic about both. That was enough. Not perfect, not invulnerable, just enough. And for the first time in his life, Vaelor Draven looked at his empire and felt something other than constant vigilance against threats. He felt peace. Not permanent, not guaranteed. Just the temporary peace that came from knowing he'd survived the test and emerged more complete than when it started. The Iron King who'd conquered territories through pure domination had become something different, something more complex, more vulnerable, more human, more real. And standing in spring gardens with the woman who'd made him remember why empire mattered, Vaelor finally understood the lesson that had taken his entire reign to learn. Survival mattered. So did tenderness. A ruler could carry a crown and still remain human, could protect what mattered while accepting vulnerability, could govern effectively while loving completely. It was harder than isolation, required more capability, not less. But it was worth it. Every conspiracy survived. Every impossible choice faced, every moment of doubt and fear and brutal reckoning, all of it worth the price of remembering he was human underneath the crown. Worth the cost of learning that the strongest thing a ruler could do was admit they needed someone. That attachment wasn't fatal weakness, but fundamental strength. That love and empire could coexist if you were brave enough to build systems that supported both. That was the legacy. Not perfect governance, but sustainable humanity. Not invulnerable strength, but resilient adaptation. And as spring sunlight touched frozen gardens, bringing them back to life, King Vaelor Draven held his queen anew with absolute certainty. The true cost of the crown had never been love. It had been the fear of it. And now that fear was dead, replaced by something infinitely more powerful. Purpose. Connection. The knowledge that he was protecting something worth any price. The empire would survive. Would adapt. Would become something better than pure domination because it was built on something more than fear. It was built on the choice one king made to be human, despite every philosophy telling him isolation was survival. And that choice changed everything.